some divine eye had witnessed his cruelty. My name is Lisa, 45 years old, a secretary at a law firm. Our marriage, nearing 2 decades, had been modest and childless. Despite our shared desire for children, infertility plagued us, primarily my own struggles. I underwent treatments, exhausting myself physically, emotionally, and financially, only to face disappointment. When I turned 40, we conceded defeat. My husband's desire for children persisted, but I couldn't endure the pain and financial strain any longer. We decided to halt treatments and embrace a childless life, opting for luxury trips instead. Yet the pang of regret lingered, especially when confronted with images of children on TV or greeting cards. Even 5 years post-treatments, guilt and remorse gnawed at me. Then, a school reunion beckoned after a decade. My husband encouraged me to take a break, sensing it as a mini vacation. It felt like a temporary escape from the weight of our childless existence. I realized I had scarcely been out alone since our wedding day, my life consumed by infertility treatments. But a little indulgence now and then couldn't hurt, right? At the venue, catching up with old friends felt refreshing. "Lisa, long time no see. You look great, slimmer than before," one friend remarked. Indeed, I had shed about 22 pounds over the past decade. "Thanks," I replied with a smile. "I envy you. Since marriage and kids, I've gained almost 33 pounds, she lamented. Her words, though innocent, stung a bit. "Any kids for you?" another friend asked. "No, we couldn't," I replied, feeling the weight of the question. "Just the 2 of us." "Oh, sorry for asking such an awkward question," she apologized. "No worries. Let's just enjoy ourselves," I reassured, trying to maintain a lively atmosphere. As conversation flowed, a startling revelation emerged. My son was nearly caught in a marriage scam recently, one classmate shared. I was taken aback. A scam? Yes, they asked him for $20,000 for their wedding, but it fell through, she explained. "What happened next?" I inquired, intrigued. "He couldn't afford it, so he came to us for advice. That's when we uncovered the scam. The woman vanished," she recounted. "It's terrifying," I murmured, shaken by the story. "There are some awful people out there," another friend chimed in. "Really scary." "A marriage scam," I mused, shocked that such deceit could occur so close to home. Thankfully, her son had moved on with a new girlfriend, and the parents seemed relieved. The reunion continued smoothly, eventually winding down. Instead of heading to the after-party, I decided to head home, reflecting on the evening's unexpected revelations. I returned to my hotel, savoring a nightcap alone. It struck me, I hadn't checked in with my husband. It was only 10 p.m. He should still be awake. Despite repeated calls, he didn't answer. Perhaps he already turned in. Well, I'd be back tomorrow, so it wasn't a pressing concern. Yet an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Was it women's intuition? Something felt off. From then on, my husband started arriving home unusually late on weekdays, often inebriated. "Hey, I'm home," he slurred one night, collapsing onto the living room floor. "Are you okay?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. "Shut up, I'm home. Show some respect," he retorted, his words clouded by alcohol. As I tidied up his discarded clothes, he muttered something about Alyssa. You know, if he were as young as Alyssa. Confusion gripped me. Who was Alyssa? What did he mean by his words? Before I could inquire further, he was already asleep. Could he be cheating on me? The unease I felt that day morphed into a creeping certainty. But no, my husband was a good man. It must be drunken nonsense. Yet doubts lingered, unsettling my thoughts. I tried to reassure myself, but my husband's erratic behavior gnawed at me. Weekends meant early departures and late returns, often accompanied by the stench of alcohol. It had become a pattern I could no longer ignore. "You're going out drinking almost every day lately. Are we okay?" I ventured one evening. "Mind your own business. It's my money," he snapped back, dismissive of my concern. "But we need to save for our future," I insisted. His response cut deep. "Well, I've spent quite a bit on treatments." "That's because you're defective." Even in his inebriated state, his words stung. I could have fathomed he'd speak to me that way. As time passed, his disparaging remarks grew more frequent. "Since you can't have kids, you should focus on showing affection to me," he'd say. With each selfish act, my love for him waned. Gone was the caring husband who once supported me through treatments. Would he ever return? After 20 years, I began questioning the essence of our marriage. But before I could confront him about it, he dropped a bombshell. "We need to talk," he said, his demeanor serious. I returned from work to find him on the sofa, his expression grave. "What's wrong? Why are you being so formal?" I asked, sensing something was amiss. "I want a divorce," he declared bluntly. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. "You're joking, right? Why would you say that all of a sudden?" I pleaded, hoping for reassurance. But the idea of divorce had never crossed his mind before. "Yes," he confirmed, leaving me stunned and bewildered. The revelation hit me like a tidal wave. Divorce? Had my husband been considering it all along? I confronted him, desperate for clarity. "Out of the blue, you want a divorce? What's going on?" I demanded, my emotions raw. "We've been together for 20 years, haven't we? Let's talk this through," I urged, hoping for understanding. But he met my plea with contempt. "You're clueless, aren't you?" he scoffed, his tone laced with bitterness. Confusion clouded my mind. "What do you mean? For 20 years I've wanted children, but because of you I've been denied that chance," he accused, his words cutting deep. His revelation blindsided me. "That's not fair. We decided together to stop treatments," I countered, feeling the weight of sadness and frustration. "I was never okay with that. I've always wanted a child," he confessed, his voice heavy with regret. Tears threatened to spill as the reality sank in. "Well, if you sign the divorce papers, I won't have anything else to say," he declared proudly, pushing the papers toward me. But his next words struck like lightning. "I've already decided to remarry." "Remarry? With a 20-year-old? I gasped, disbelief coursing through me. "That's right. Alyssa," he confirmed, a smug satisfaction in his tone. Alyssa, the name echoed in my mind, the same name he had mentioned before. Woman's intuition, it seemed, was not to be underestimated. I felt a flicker of self-satisfaction, but I knew it wasn't the time for indulgence. Then my husband showed me a picture of his so-called adorable Alyssa. As I examined it closely, I struggled to contain my laughter. Surely, this had to be a joke. How could something like this be real? I prayed he didn't notice my odd reaction and swiftly composed myself. "So, you really want a child that badly?" I questioned, masking my incredulity. "Yes, because you can't give birth. There's nothing we can do about that, right? You'll agree to the divorce, won't you?" he pressed, oblivious to my internal turmoil. "I suppose there's no choice," I replied, feigning distress, though secretly his sheer idiocy made the decision easier. With each passing moment, the thought of divorcing him grew more appealing. It felt like divine intervention guiding me toward the right path. With a heavy heart, or so I pretended, I signed the divorce papers and left him behind. I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. Surely, he would regret his actions soon enough. Time would tell. Fast forward a year after the divorce, and I encountered him on my way home from work. His appearance shocked me. "Lisa, please help me," he pleaded, his shabby appearance a stark contrast to the man I once knew. "Excuse me, who are you?" I asked, genuinely not recognizing him. "It's me, Lisa. I need your help," he insisted, desperation evident in his voice. I hesitated, taken aback by his transformation. "Long time no see," I finally managed, unsure of how to react. In that moment, I realized the tables had turned. It was now his turn to seek assistance, and I held all the cards. "Please introduce me to your company's lawyer," he implored, his request a humbling reminder of his downfall. I couldn't just agree to help out of the blue. It seemed my ex-husband was facing financial troubles. I had sensed it from his appearance, but I never imagined he would change so drastically within a year. "If it's your first consultation, it's free, but to hire them, you'll have to pay their fee," I explained, trying to navigate the situation. "I don't have that kind of money. Please help me," he pleaded, desperation evident in his voice. Perplexed by his sudden predicament, I decided to hear him out. We found ourselves in a nearby cafe, where he began to share his story. "Well, actually," he started, but before he could finish, I interjected. "Did that girl Alyssa run off?" I asked, a sudden realization dawning on me. "How did you know?" he responded, surprise evident in his voice. "Just as I suspected. When you showed me a picture of a girl named Alyssa, it clicked. She looked exactly like the one who killed a classmate's son at a reunion," I explained, recalling the warning given by the classmate about a woman named Sally, approximately 22 years old. Her age and name are probably fake, of course. The swindler wouldn't use her real name, I added, connecting the dots. Of course you knew about Alyssa, didn't you? He questioned, realization settling in. Well, I guess you could say I knew. But what happened? I inquired, eager to unravel the full story. When I pressed my husband for an explanation, this was the story he offered. About a year ago, he met a woman named Alyssa at a nightclub. My husband, who had always harbored a desire for children, seemed to have shared his thoughts with her. It was during one of these conversations that Alyssa made an astonishing offer. She could bear a child for him. Their relationship blossomed from there. He started frequenting the club almost every weekday and spent weekends with Alyssa outside its confines. In the process, he depleted $10,000 from his savings, accumulated during his single days. Despite this, Alyssa never demanded lavish gifts or expensive outings. She was content just to share a drink with him at the club. She was different, he insisted. Not like the stereotypical club girls you often hear about. She didn't care about designer goods or jewelry. She was happy as long as I was there with her. He painted Alyssa as hardworking and sincere, emphasizing their agreement not to touch each other's savings from their single days. I thought it was his money and he could use it as he pleased, I admitted, unaware of his extravagant spending. Then my husband revealed the twist in the tale. Alyssa's true colors had emerged. I want to get married, but I had debts totaling about $20,000. Then my husband promised to take on Alyssa's debt and transferred the money to her, I recounted, my voice heavy with regret. They moved in together right after our divorce, but Alyssa continued her nighttime work and rarely came home. Eventually, she quit her job at the club and disappeared, taking all the money with her. How could he be so foolish? I lamented, feeling a sense of despair at having been married to such a man for 20 years. Did you make a promissory note? I inquired, hoping for some semblance of responsibility. A what? My husband looked puzzled. You lent her money, didn't you? Didn't you get a note? I pressed, frustration creeping into my tone. We were going to be a couple, so I didn't do such a thing, he admitted. So, you basically gave her the money, is that it? I asked incredulously. In this case, it seems like you donated $20,000 to Alyssa out of goodwill, I concluded, my disappointment palpable. This woman must be a pro, I mused, realizing the extent of her deception. In the case of donations, if the amount exceeds $11,000 in a year, gift tax is imposed. Depending on the case, the receiver might be taxed. So, Alyssa just took $20,000 in cash and vanished, splitting the money into two parts across 2 different years to avoid taxes. The reason my husband thought she was a good girl who never asked for material gifts was because she knew the law well. So, what should I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed. I don't know. Maybe consult a lawyer. It'll cost you though, he replied, his shoulders slumping in defeat. All my savings from my single days are gone, and the woman I loved ran away from me. I can't go back on my word to the company about remarrying after boasting about getting a younger wife. Isn't that his own doing? I thought, feeling the weight of my husband's pitiful situation. Lisa, it's my fault. Please come back to me, he pleaded. I realized after you were gone, you were the only one who cared about me. I don't need kids anymore. I'll let you do as you like. You must have been lonely too, right? But his misunderstanding persisted. That matter had ended half a year ago in my mind, so I confronted him with reality. You know, it's been a year. What's with this sudden change of heart? Isn't it a little too late now? Lisa, are you going to abandon me? Well, it was you who pushed for our divorce in the first place, remember? I reminded him. You're the only one I can rely on. My ex-husband looked utterly exhausted, and I decided to show him a little mercy. All right then, shall I call up a lawyer friend of mine? Lisa, thank you. I knew I could count on you, he said, tears welling up in his eyes. Mr. Johnson, the lawyer for my company, arrived at the coffee shop. John, over here, I called out, and my ex-husband seemed somewhat perplexed by our overly familiar demeanor. You see, we've been dating for the past 6 months now, I explained. What was it you needed advice on? As I finished speaking, my ex-husband looked as if he was in a daze. No, well, I think that'll be it for today, he muttered, suddenly snapping back to reality and hurriedly leaving the coffee shop. In the end, he couldn't afford to hire a lawyer and resigned himself to his fate. Rumor had it that his company was abuzz with talk of his unfortunate situation, left by his soon-to-be wife and ignored by his ex-wife. As Mr. Johnson and I spoke later, I confessed the truth about the charade. I'm sorry for involving you in all this, I apologize. No worries, Lisa. I'm glad I could be of help, he reassured me. By the way, do you have any plans after this? Caught off guard by the unexpected turn of events, I was a little flustered, but a fresh start in my mid-40s didn't seem like such a bad beginning. Yes, I'd love to, I agreed, certain that a fun-filled future was awaiting me. I couldn't shake off this feeling of excitement.
My name is Jody, a 32-year-old lawyer with a life that, from the outside, seems like a fairy tale. I come from a family that's pretty well off, and I've known Ethan, the guy I'm supposed to marry, since we were kids. Our dads are old buddies who used to joke about us tying the knot one day. I remember one summer evening, during one of our family's joint dinners, our fathers brought up the topic again. I was about 10, and Ethan was 13. Ethan's dad, Mr. Thompson, laughed heartily and said, "Mark my words, Ethan, one day you'll marry Jody here, and our companies will be stronger for it." My dad joined in, chuckling, "Absolutely, John. These two will unite our legacies." I remember blushing furiously. Ethan just rolled his eyes and mumbled, as if I'd ever marry a kid. Back then, I was head over heels for Ethan. But he always saw me as the annoying little girl who followed him around. Despite his attitude, I couldn't help but nurture a small hope that one day, he'd see me differently. Years passed, and we both pursued our own paths. I dived into law, and Ethan became a hotshot financier in his father's company. Our paths rarely crossed, but I always kept tabs on him, my childhood crush never really fading away. During college, our families met less frequently, but the marriage joke continued. At a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 22, Mr. Thompson nudged Ethan and said, "So, Ethan, when are you going to make an honest woman out of Jody?" Ethan, who had had a bit too much to drink, replied loudly, "Fine. If Jody isn't married by 32, and I'm still single, I'll marry her. Happy now?" Everyone laughed, but I felt a strange mix of hope and embarrassment. The thought that Ethan might one day be my husband lingered in my mind like a stubborn perfume. I dated a bit after that, but nothing serious. Part of me always compared every guy to Ethan, and they all fell short. As for Ethan, he was seen with various women over the years, never settling down. I remember the day Ethan proposed like it was yesterday. It was a typical Tuesday evening, and I had just returned from a long day at the law firm. I was exhausted, my mind still buzzing with the day's cases, when I found Ethan waiting for me at my apartment. "Hey, Jody," he greeted me casually, as if it was normal for him to be there. "Ethan? What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged, "Thought I'd drop by. We need to talk." My heart raced. "We need to talk," those words never meant anything good in my experience. "Sure, let's talk. Is everything all right?" I tried to sound calm, but my voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. Ethan took a deep breath. "Look, you know the promise I made years ago? About marrying you if we're both still single at 32. "Yeah," I replied, a lump forming in my throat. I wasn't sure where this was going. "Well, I'm a man of my word. So, here." He pulled out a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple, yet elegant ring. "Will you marry me, Jody?" I was stunned. This wasn't the proposal I had dreamed of, but it was Ethan, and that was all that mattered. "Yes, Ethan, I will," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He slid the ring onto my finger, and that was it. No hug, no kiss, just a nod from him. "We should tell our parents. They'll be thrilled," he said, already reaching for his phone. I nodded, still processing what had just happened. This was it. I was going to marry Ethan. The next few days were a whirlwind. Our families met for dinner to celebrate the engagement. "Ethan, I can't tell you how happy this makes me," Mr. Thompson said, clapping Ethan on the back. "Yeah, it's great," Ethan replied, his tone flat. My dad raised his glass. to Jody and Ethan, may this union bring happiness and prosperity to both our families. To Jody and Ethan, everyone echoed. The dinner was filled with laughter and plans for the future. Everyone was excited, talking about the wedding and how perfect it was for the two families to unite at last. But as I sat there, listening to them, I couldn't help but feel like a bystander in my own life. This was everything I had ever wanted, so why did it feel so hollow? But then, another part of me argued that this was Ethan, the man I had loved all my life. Maybe, with time, he would come to love me. Give it a chance, Jody, I whispered to myself. Maybe this is the start of something wonderful. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that everything would be all right. That this marriage, this union of two families, would somehow turn into the love story I had always dreamed of. The civil ceremony was a quiet affair, just our immediate families and a few close friends. Ethan's dad, Mr. Thompson, got teary-eyed as we exchanged vows. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, wiping his eyes. My parents were beaming, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel a bit of happiness. After the civil ceremony, the real challenge began, planning the grand wedding. We decided on a 2-month timeline, which meant I had my work cut out for me. I dove into the preparations headfirst, hoping it would distract me from my doubts. One evening, I was sitting with a mountain of bridal magazines, trying to pick a theme for the wedding. Ethan walked in, late from work as usual. "Hey," I said, looking up. "What do you think about a vintage theme for the wedding?" Ethan glanced at the magazines and then at me. "Whatever you want, Jody. It's your day." I felt a twinge of disappointment at his indifference. "But it's our day," I protested softly. He sighed. "I'm beat, Jody. Just pick whatever you like. I'm sure it'll be great." He then walked away, leaving me alone with my magazines. I shook off the feeling of rejection and continued with the plans. Dress shopping was next on my list. I invited my mom and Ethan's mom, Mrs. Thompson, to join me. At the bridal shop, I tried on dress after dress, but nothing felt right. My mom was getting impatient. "Jody, they all look beautiful. Just pick one." Mrs. Thompson was more understanding. "Take your time, dear. It's a big decision." Finally, I found the perfect dress. It was elegant and simple, just what I had always imagined. "This is the one," I said, looking at myself in the mirror. Both moms agreed, and we celebrated with a small lunch. Mrs. Thompson brought up the topic of Ethan. "He's always been a bit reserved. Don't take it to heart, dear." I nodded, but her words didn't provide much comfort. The weeks flew by, and the wedding day was fast approaching. I was in the midst of choosing cakes and finalizing the guest list when I realized I hadn't seen much of Ethan. He was always at work or too tired to discuss anything when he was home. As the wedding day neared, I felt more like a wedding planner than a bride. My excitement was replaced by a sense of loneliness and a growing realization that maybe this marriage was more about convenience than love. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had to focus on the wedding. Maybe, after the wedding, things would change. Maybe Ethan would be different. The day my world came crashing down started like any other. I was at work, buried under a mountain of case files, when a sudden wave of nausea hit me. I hadn't been feeling well all morning, so I decided to head home early. I pulled up to our house, noticing Ethan's car in the driveway. That was odd, he was never home this early. Quietly, I unlocked the front door, not wanting to startle him. Maybe he was sick too, I thought. As I stepped inside, I heard Ethan's voice coming from the living room. He was on the phone. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed closer. "No, baby, I can't wait to see you tonight," Ethan said, his voice soft and affectionate. My heart skipped a beat. Who was he talking to? I pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. "Yeah, marrying Jody is a pain, but it's worth it. Once I get control of the companies, we'll be set. Don't worry, after she pops out a kid, I'll dump her." he continued. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This couldn't be happening. The room spun around me as I struggled to process his words. Yeah, she's clueless. Thinks I actually love her, he chuckled. That chuckle, so cold and cruel, shattered the last bit of hope I had. I couldn't listen anymore. I stumbled back to the front door, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there, to breathe. As I slammed the door shut behind me, I heard Ethan call out, "Jody, is that you?" I didn't look back. I got into my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to be away from that house, away from Ethan. I ended up at a park, sitting on a bench, watching families and couples around me, oblivious to my world falling apart. How could I have been so blind? How could I not see what Ethan really was? I had to make a decision. Confronting Ethan was the obvious choice, but what then? Cause a scene, break off the engagement, and be the talk of our families and friends? Or play along, keep my dignity, and figure out what to do next? As the sun set, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let Ethan see how much he had hurt me. I would play his game, for now, but on my terms. I had to be smart about this. I drove home, my face a mask of calm. Ethan was waiting for me, a concerned look on his face. "Where were you?" "I was worried," he said, coming towards me. "I wasn't feeling well, just needed some fresh air," I lied smoothly. He nodded. "Okay, well, I'm here now. Let's have dinner." I forced a smile. "Sure, that sounds great." As we sat eating, I looked at Ethan, really looked at him. This was the man I had loved my whole life, and now, he was nothing but a stranger to me. That night, as Ethan slept beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. One thing was clear, I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. Ethan had no idea who he was dealing with. Lying next to Ethan that night, I couldn't shake off the mix of anger and betrayal boiling inside me. I needed to know more, to understand the extent of his deceit. Quietly, I reached for his phone on the nightstand. My hands were trembling as I unlocked it, thank goodness for easy-to-guess passwords. I opened his messages and there it was, a string of texts with someone named Julia. My heart raced as I scrolled through their conversations. They were planning to meet the night before our wedding, in our house. An extreme date, in the presence of a sleeping wife, is exactly what they called their plan. So that I wouldn't disturb them, they planned to give me strong sleeping pills. The audacity of it made my blood boil. "Ethan, you bastard," I muttered under my breath. I heard him stir and quickly place the phone back, pretending to be asleep. My mind was racing with thoughts of revenge. I couldn't let them get away with this. I needed a plan, something to turn the tables on Ethan and his mistress. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. Ethan was his usual self, indifferent and preoccupied with work. I kissed him goodbye and watched him leave for the office. Once he was gone, I sat down with a cup of coffee, thinking about my next move. I decided to reach out to an old friend from law school, Mike. He was now a private investigator and could be the key to gathering the evidence I needed against Ethan. I met Mike at a small cafe downtown. He looked concerned when I told him about Ethan's betrayal. "Jody, I'm so sorry. What do you need me to do?" he asked. "I need evidence, Mike. Photos, texts, anything that can prove what he's up to," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Mike nodded. "Consider it done. I'll get you everything you need." "Thank you, Mike. I can't let him get away with this," I replied, feeling a sense of empowerment for the first time since I heard Ethan's conversation. That evening, Ethan came home late again. We sat down for dinner, the tension between us palpable. "Is everything okay, Jody? You seem distant," Ethan said, his eyes not meeting mine. I forced a smile, just tired from wedding planning. "You know how it is." He nodded. "Yeah, I guess. Listen, I'll be working late tomorrow night. Don't wait up for me. I felt a flash of anger but kept my composure. Sure, no problem. Work comes first, right? He didn't detect the sarcasm in my voice. Exactly. Glad you understand. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but think about how blind I had been. Ethan never loved me. It was all a lie, a means to an end for him. But I wasn't going to be a pawn in his game any longer. I had Mike gathering evidence, and soon I'd have enough to expose Ethan for the fraud he was. But that wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the humiliation and betrayal I felt. I started planning the ultimate revenge in my mind, a way to turn the tables and leave Ethan with nothing. He thought he was playing me, but he had no idea what was coming for him. The eve of our wedding arrived with a heavy air of anticipation. Ethan seemed more on edge than usual, but I pretended not to notice. I was too focused on my plan, the final act of this tragic play. Ethan came home early, which was unusual. He was carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Thought we could celebrate our last night as an unmarried couple, he said with a forced smile. I played along, hiding my contempt. That sounds lovely, I replied, mustering a smile. As he poured the champagne, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment he'd try to drug me, as per his plan with Julia. We clinked glasses, and I brought the champagne to my lips, pretending to sip while actually letting it run down the side of my mouth. Ethan didn't notice, he was too busy texting under the table. Probably Julia, I thought bitterly. After a few minutes, I feigned dizziness. Ethan, I'm not feeling so well. I think I need to lie down. He looked up, satisfaction flashing in his eyes for a moment. Oh, okay. Do you need any help? No, I'll be fine. Just need some rest, I said, standing up shakily. As I made my way to the bedroom, I heard Ethan make a phone call. She's out. You can come over now, he whispered. My heart raced. This was it. My plan was about to unfold. Once in the bedroom, I quietly locked the door and slipped under the covers, pretending to be asleep. I heard the front door open and close a while later, and then low voices coming from the living room. Ethan and Julia, no doubt. I waited for what felt like hours, my body tense with anticipation. Then, I made my move. I grabbed my phone and called both our parents, whispering a quick lie about a surprise for them at the house. Mom, Dad, you need to come over right now. I have a surprise for Ethan and I want you to be part of it, I said, my voice trembling with feigned excitement. Really, honey? At this hour? Okay, we'll be right there, my mom replied, confused but intrigued. I made the same call to Ethan's parents, ensuring that everyone would arrive at the same time. Then, I sat in the dark, waiting for the moment of truth. The sound of the doorbell broke the silence of the night. I heard footsteps and then voices of confusion and anger. I slipped out of bed and made my way to the living room. The scene before me was one of chaos. Ethan and Julia, caught in a compromising position, our parents standing in the doorway, shocked and appalled. What the hell is this, Ethan? Mr. Thompson roared, his face red with anger. Ethan was speechless, his eyes wide with shock. Julia was scrambling to cover herself, looking around frantically. I stepped into the room, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. Surprise, I said, my voice cold. The confrontation was intense. Accusations flew, tears were shed, and the truth came out in the ugliest way. Ethan tried to explain, but his words fell on deaf ears. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a strange sense of relief. The charade was over. I was free from the lies and deceit. I watched as Ethan's world crumbled around him. He had lost everything in one fell swoop, his family, his reputation, and any future he might have had with me. The aftermath of Ethan's betrayal left the house in a haunting silence. As I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cold coffee before me, my mind was a battleground of emotions. The dramatic revelation had left me reeling, but also ignited a flame of determination within. I spent the next few days in a flurry of activity. Meetings with my lawyer, going over the evidence Mike, the private detective, had gathered. The photos of Ethan with Julia, their intimate texts, and the damning correspondence where they planned to drug me with a powerful sleeping pill, it was all there. Ethan attempted to reach out several times, but I ignored his calls and messages. There was nothing left to say to him. On the day of the court hearing, I donned my sharpest suit, a symbol of the new, unyielding woman I had become. Walking into the courtroom, I saw Ethan, a shell of the confident man he once was. The hearing was intense. My lawyer presented the evidence with clinical precision. Ethan's lawyer tried to defend, but the proof was irrefutable. After the hearing, Ethan approached me, a look of desperation in his eyes. "Jody, please, can we talk?" he implored. I faced him, the man who had shattered my trust. "What's left to say, Ethan?" My voice was calm but laced with disdain. I'm sorry, Jody. I never thought it would go this far," he stammered. "Sorry isn't good enough." "You made your choices, Ethan," I replied, turning my back on him. Over the following months, the legal battle raged on, but my resolve never wavered. The evidence was damning, and eventually, justice was served. Ethan was ordered to pay a significant sum for emotional damages. Leaving the courtroom for the last time, a wave of relief washed over me. I had stood up to Ethan and emerged victorious. That chapter of my life was closed. I was ready to move forward, stronger and more resilient. Ethan was now a part of my past, a difficult chapter, but one that had taught me the strength I possessed. Walking out of the courthouse, the final gavel still ringing in my ears, marked more than just a legal victory. It was the end of a chapter, a painful saga that had changed me in ways I never imagined. As I stepped into the sunlight, a sense of liberation enveloped me, the chains of my past finally broken. I didn't head home immediately. Instead, I found solace in a quaint park, a place that once held memories of Ethan and me. Now, it symbolized a fresh start. Sitting on an old bench, basking in the warmth of the sun, I pondered over the recent events. My phone vibrated with a message from my friend Lisa. "You're a rock star, Jody. Ready to celebrate your freedom?" I smiled, replying, "Absolutely. Just need a moment to myself first." "Take your time, girl. We'll party when you're up for it," she responded. As I sat there, lost in thought, I was approached by an elderly woman. "You're Jody, right?" I was in the courtroom. "What you did, standing up for yourself, was incredibly brave," she said softly. Her words touched a deep chord within me. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary," I replied, feeling a swell of pride. "You've inspired me, dear," she said before walking away, leaving me with a sense of purpose and strength. That evening, a small celebration with close friends marked the beginning of a new era. Laughter and cheers filled the air as we toasted to new beginnings. The next day brought an unexpected turn. While out for a walk, I received a call from Ethan. His voice was desperate, a stark contrast to the confident man I once knew. "Jody, please, I need your help," he pleaded. "What's wrong, Ethan?" I asked, although I had a guess. "My father, after everything that came out, he's considering kicking me out of the company and disinheriting me. You have to talk to him, convince him not to." Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Karma had caught up with him. "Ethan, what you're asking? I can't do that. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences," I said calmly. "But Jody, I have nothing left. Please, I'm begging you," he implored. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of empowerment. "No, Ethan. It's time for you to face the music. Goodbye." I hung up, cutting off any further pleas. Walking back home, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. Ethan's downfall was a result of his own actions, and I no longer bore any responsibility for his fate. In the following weeks, I threw myself into work and rekindled old hobbies. Friends and family surrounded me, their support unwavering. Life was moving forward, and so was I. One evening, as I relaxed with a book, a realization dawned on me: I was content. The turmoil of the past had given way to peace, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. The journey had been tumultuous, filled with betrayal and heartache, but it had also taught me resilience and self-worth. I had stood up for myself, sought justice, and emerged stronger. Life has a funny way of throwing surprises at you. I'm Hannah, a 25-year-old woman who learned this lesson in the most unexpected place, a bustling coffee shop on a busy Tuesday morning. That day, my life took a turn when I crossed paths with Chris, a man who seemed to step right out of a story of everyday heroism. The coffee shop was my sanctuary, a place away from the high expectations of my wealthy family. I sat at my usual corner table, sipping a latte and scrolling through my phone, when I heard snickers behind me. It was the Johnson twins, notorious bullies from my college days. "Look who's here, all alone. Daddy's little girl," sneered Mark, the taller of the two. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my phone, but they weren't done. "I bet that purse costs more than our rent," added Matt, his voice dripping with mockery. Feeling my cheeks burn, I muttered under my breath, "Just leave me alone." That's when Chris, who until that moment was just another customer, stepped in. He was tall, with a rugged look and a confident stance. "Guys, cut it out. She's not bothering you," Chris said, his voice calm but authoritative. Mark laughed mawkishly. "And who are you, her knight in shining armor?" Chris didn't flinch. "Just a guy who hates bullies. Why don't you pick on someone who fights back?" The twins looked taken aback. Matt retorted, "We're just having a bit of fun, man. No need to get worked up." Chris's gaze was unwavering. "It's not fun if she's not laughing. How about showing some respect?" The tension was thick. The twins exchanged a glance, shrugged, and walked away, muttering insults under their breath. Chris turned to me, his face softening. "Sorry about that. Some people just can't grow up. You okay?" he asked, a genuine concern in his eyes. I was still processing the swift change in events. "Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for stepping in. That was really brave of you." Chris just smiled and shrugged it off. "I'm Chris, by the way. Couldn't just stand by and watch." "I'm Hannah. You really didn't have to do that, but I'm grateful." We ended up talking more. Chris was funny, with a no-nonsense attitude and a surprisingly warm smile. He told me about his job at a local mechanic shop and his passion for fixing up old cars. It was refreshing to talk to someone so grounded and real. As our conversation flowed, I realized how easy it was to talk to him. He listened intently, laughed at my jokes, and shared stories of his own. He had this effortless charm about him that was hard to ignore. When it was time to leave, I found myself wishing the conversation didn't have to end. Chris walked me to the door, and we exchanged numbers. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. Meeting Chris felt like the beginning of something new and unexpected. It's funny how life works. One moment you're just going about your day, and the next, you meet someone who changes everything. That day in the coffee shop, I met Chris, and little did I know, my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. Meeting Chris, who had bravely stood up for me at a coffee shop, had quickly turned my life into a whirlwind romance. First came the visit to Chris's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, in their cozy suburban home. Mrs. Johnson, a petite woman with a big heart, greeted us with open arms. "Chris. And this must be Hannah. We've heard so much about you." I felt a warmth in her embrace. "It's really nice to meet you, Mrs. Johnson," I said, smiling. "Oh, please, call me Linda," she insisted, leading us into a living room that felt lived in and welcoming. Mr. Johnson, a tall man with a firm handshake, joined us. "Welcome, Hannah. We're glad Chris found someone special. The conversation over dinner was heartfelt. They asked about my life, and for the first time, I felt valued for who I was, not for my family's wealth. The real challenge, however, was introducing Chris to my parents. My father, a real estate tycoon, and my mother, a high-profile lawyer, had standards as high as skyscrapers. Their reception was polite but cold. "Dad, Mom, this is Chris." I introduced him, trying to mask my nervousness. Chris, maintaining his composure, extended a handshake. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, it's an honor to meet you." My dad's handshake was firm, his eyes scrutinizing. "Chris, I hear you work at a mechanic shop. Tell me, how do you plan to provide for my daughter?" Chris didn't miss a beat. "I'm saving up, sir. Planning to run my own shop someday." The dinner felt more like an interrogation, with my dad throwing sharp questions, almost challenging Chris's worth. After Chris left, my dad summoned me to his study. "Hannah, that boy isn't right for you," he said, his voice stern. He slid a folder across his desk towards me. "I've done some digging. You need to see this." Furious, I pushed the folder back without opening it. "I can't believe you'd stoop this low. I trust Chris." "Hannah, don't be a fool," he retorted, his voice rising. "This isn't just a game. It's your future." I grabbed the folder, tore it in half, and stormed out, leaving the pieces on the floor. I was fuming. How dare he pry into Chris's life and judge him without knowing him? That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing. Part of me wondered if I was too quick to dismiss my father's concerns, but my heart was steadfast. Chris was the man I loved, and no background check was going to change that. As our wedding day approached, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of requests from Chris and his parents. It all started one evening at Chris's house, a few months before the wedding. "Hannah, we were thinking," Chris started, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "Since you, well, you know, have the means, could you maybe cover the wedding expenses?" His parents, Linda and Mr. Johnson, nodded in agreement, their eyes hopeful yet a bit too eager. I was taken aback but masked my surprise with a smile. "Sure, I can do that. It's our special day, after all." As the weeks passed, their requests grew. We were at a high-end boutique, selecting wedding attire when Linda pointed at an extravagant dress. "Oh, Hannah, this is beautiful, but it's so pricey." I caught the hint. "Don't worry, Linda. If you like it, it's yours." Mr. Johnson chimed in, eyeing a suit. "Well, if we're all dressing up, might as well go all out, right?" I laughed, a bit nervously, and nodded. "Of course, Mr. Johnson." Their gratitude was short-lived and soon turned into expectation. Every meeting brought a new request. "Hannah, dear, could we add this to the menu? Or, how about a bigger flower arrangement?" I found myself agreeing each time, partly because I was in love and partly because I didn't want to disappoint them. But deep down, I felt a twinge of resentment at their growing entitlement. On the wedding day, everything was lavish, paid for from my pocket. Chris looked dashing, and his parents were beaming in their expensive outfits. My parents arrived, their expressions stiff. After the ceremony, during the reception, my father stood up to speak. The room fell silent. "Hannah has always lived a life of luxury," he began, his voice stern. "But it's time she learned the real world. As of today, she's financially cut off." A wave of whispers swept through the room. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Chris squeezed my hand, his expression a mix of shock and worry. "Dad, you can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "This is for your own good, Hannah. You need to learn to fend for yourself," he replied, unyielding. The rest of the evening felt surreal. Chris and his parents were unusually quiet. As we left, Chris pulled me aside. "Hannah, what are we going to do?" I forced a smile. "We'll manage, Chris. We have each other." But as we drove away, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. My father's words echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that my once blissful relationship was about to face its toughest test yet. The honeymoon period didn't last long after the wedding. I quickly realized that my marriage to Chris was going to be nothing like I had imagined. The shift was abrupt and jarring. We moved into Chris's parents' house temporarily, or so I thought. The first morning, I came down to breakfast and was met with cold stares from Linda and Mr. Johnson. The air was thick with tension. "Morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Linda didn't look up from her coffee. "You should start looking for a job, Hannah. We can't afford to feed an extra mouth here." I was taken aback. "Oh," I thought. "I mean, Chris and I talked about me finding something, but I didn't expect." Mr. Johnson cut in, his tone harsh. "Well, your father cut you off, right? Time to pull your weight." I looked at Chris, hoping for some support, but he just stared at his plate. The loving, caring man I married seemed to have vanished. The following days were worse. Chris had turned cold and distant. One evening, as we were clearing the dinner table, he said, "You need to start contributing, Hannah. It's not fair to my parents." I felt a lump in my throat. "Chris, I'm trying. I didn't expect things to change this fast." He scoffed. "Welcome to the real world, Hannah. You can't always rely on Daddy's money." His words stung. I retreated to our room, feeling alone and betrayed. The man who once defended me in public was now a stranger, echoing his parents' harshness. The situation at home became increasingly difficult. Chris's parents treated me more like a burden than a family member. One afternoon, Mr. Johnson cornered me in the living room. "Hannah, you need to fix things with your father." "We need that money," he demanded, his eyes cold and calculating. I stood my ground, although my voice shook. "I won't beg my father for money. I thought you welcomed me as family, not for my father's wealth." He laughed bitterly. "Family? No, we thought you were our ticket to an easy life. But you're just a spoiled brat with no sense of reality." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The loving family facade had fallen away, revealing their true motives. I was a means to an end, nothing more. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on me. I was trapped in a house with people who saw me as nothing more than a cash cow, and the man I loved had turned into someone I didn't recognize. I missed my old life, but I was determined not to run back to my father. I had to figure this out on my own. But as the days passed, the weight of my situation grew heavier. I was stuck in a loveless marriage, with in-laws who only cared about what I could bring them financially. The harsh reality of my new life was nothing like the fairy tale I had envisioned. I was in a battle, not just for my independence, but for my dignity and self-worth. Living in Chris's parents' house, Hannah, was starting to feel the walls closing in on me. The atmosphere was tense, and the kindness I once saw in Chris and his family had completely vanished. Then, things started to disappear, first small items, then something big. One morning, I noticed my engagement ring wasn't on my bedside table where I usually kept it. Panicking, I searched the room, but it was nowhere to be found. "Chris, have you seen my ring?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. He shrugged, not even looking up from his phone. "Maybe you misplaced it. It'll turn up." But it didn't. A few days later, I confronted Linda about it. "Linda, my engagement ring is missing. It's really important to me." Her response was cold, devoid of the warmth I once knew. "Maybe you should be more careful with your things, Hannah." I couldn't believe her indifference. That ring was the last symbol of the love Chris and I shared, or so I thought. Then, more items started disappearing, a pair of earrings here, a designer handbag there. It was like pieces of my old life were being erased, one item at a time. One evening, I caught Linda rummaging through my closet. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Linda turned, a pair of my shoes in her hand. We need money, Hannah. These things are just sitting here. I was shocked. You're selling my things? How could you? Chris walked in, overhearing the confrontation. Hannah, we're struggling here. You can't just expect to live off us. I stared at him, disbelief and hurt welling up inside me. So, you're okay with this? With your parents selling my belongings? He avoided my gaze. We have to get by somehow. I felt betrayed and alone. The people I once called family were now treating me like an ATM, disposing of my possessions without a second thought. Night after night, I lay awake, wondering how my fairy tale romance had turned into this nightmare. I was living with people who saw me as nothing more than a source of income. My love, my trust, my belongings, all were being taken from me, piece by piece. It was a harsh awakening. The life I had known, the love I had cherished, all seemed like a distant dream. I was trapped in a reality where I was nothing more than a means to an end, and my heart ached with the weight of this cruel revelation. The days at Chris's parents' house grew longer and darker for me. I was struggling to grasp the reality of my situation. I felt isolated, with my belongings disappearing and the family I married into showing their true colors. But nothing prepared me for the chilling discovery I was about to make. It was a late evening, and I was heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when I overheard hushed voices from the living room. Curiosity piqued, I tiptoed closer. It was Chris, Linda, and Mr. Johnson, talking in low, urgent tones. We need to figure something out, and fast, Chris was saying, his voice laced with frustration. Linda chimed in, we're at our wits' end. Hannah's not of much use anymore, not without her father's money. I felt a chill run down my spine. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more. Mr. Johnson's voice was gruff. We could try reaching out to her father, make up some story. Maybe a health scare, something that'll make him open his wallet. My heart pounded in my chest. Were they really plotting to extort money from my father by lying? Chris's response was even more shocking. No, he won't buy it. We need something more convincing. Maybe if something were to happen to Hannah, an accident, he'd be more inclined to help. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband, the man I loved, was suggesting putting me in harm's way to get money. Linda's voice was cold. That might work. Her father would have to pay up then. I felt sick to my stomach. Trembling, I backed away from the door, my mind racing. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a threat to my safety. The next morning, Chris found me in the kitchen, his demeanor oddly calm. Hannah, you look stressed. Everything okay? I masked my fear, opting to keep my knowledge of their plan to myself. Just a headache, I lied. Chris's eyes narrowed slightly. You know, your phone is pretty valuable. We could sell it for some extra cash. Panic surged through me, but I had to think fast. Actually, I was thinking, maybe I could call my dad. Ask him for some money. Chris's expression changed to one of interest. Really? You'd do that? I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, I'll talk to him. Just let me keep my phone for now. He eyed me for a moment, then shrugged. Fine. But make it quick. We need the money. I nodded, relief washing over me. Keeping my phone meant I had a lifeline, a way to get help. As Chris walked away, I realized the gravity of my situation. I was in a house with people who saw me as nothing more than a cash cow, willing to go to any lengths to get what they wanted. That day, I understood the true colors of the man I married and his family. They were not the loving, caring people I thought I knew. Instead, they were predators, ready to sacrifice my well-being for their gain. Trapped in a house with people plotting against me, I was gripped by fear and desperation. With my father's number dialed on my phone, I faced Chris and his parents, who insisted on being present during the call. Go on, call him. We want to hear what he says, Chris demanded, a hard edge to his voice. Mr. Johnson stood with his arms crossed, nodding in agreement. Yeah, let's see if your daddy really cares. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the call button, my hands trembling. "Dad, it's Hannah," I said, trying to sound calm. "Hannah, what's going on?" Dad's voice was filled with concern. Remembering the code phrase he taught me as a child, I said casually, "Dad, do you remember my old teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles? I really miss him." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Yes, I remember. Don't worry, we'll take care of it," Dad replied, his voice now stern with a hidden urgency. Chris and his parents looked at each other, confused by our cryptic exchange. "So, is he going to send the money?" Chris asked, his impatience growing. I nodded, playing along. "Yes," he said, "he'll help us." An hour passed, the longest hour of my life. Chris and his parents were smirking, confident in their deceitful plan. But their smug expressions turned to horror as the front door was suddenly kicked open. Men in suits, clearly my father's security, stormed in. My father was right behind them, his face a mask of fury and concern. "What the hell is this?" Mr. Johnson blustered, stepping forward only to be restrained by the security. Chris stood up, his face pale. "Mr. Anderson, what are you doing here?" My father's gaze was icy as he walked up to me. "Hannah, are you all right?" I nodded, fighting back tears. "Yes, Dad, I'm okay, now." He turned to Chris and his parents, his voice thundering through the room. "You've been threatening my daughter, trying to manipulate her? That's not going to fly." Chris tried to speak, but the security team was already handcuffing him and his parents. The realization that their plan had failed was written all over their faces. As the police arrived to take over, my father wrapped his arm around my shoulders, leading me out of the house. The place I had once entered with hope and love was now a scene of a failed extortion plot. Sitting in my father's car, driving away from that nightmare, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The danger was over, thanks to the secret code and my father's swift action. After the terrifying ordeal with Chris and his parents, I found myself sitting in a courtroom, a mix of anxiety and determination in my heart. As I sat there, waiting for the trial to begin, my father, sitting next to me, squeezed my hand. "You're doing the right thing, Hannah," he whispered. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Chris, Linda, and Mr. Johnson were brought in, their faces a mixture of shame and defiance. The trial began, and it was my turn to testify. Standing there, facing the people I once called family, I felt a surge of courage. "Your Honor, these people manipulated and threatened me. They planned to harm me for financial gain," I said, my voice steady. Chris's lawyer tried to discredit me. "Isn't it true, Miss Anderson, that you're just a spoiled rich girl, upset over a family dispute?" I held my ground. "No, this is about them trying to use me. They saw me as nothing more than a cash cow." The evidence was overwhelming, especially the recording of their plot and the testimony from my father's security team. Chris and his parents sat there, heads bowed, as the reality of their actions sank in. Finally, the judge delivered the verdict. For the crimes of extortion and conspiracy to commit harm, I sentenced the defendants. The judge's words were a blur as relief washed over me. Justice was being served. Chris and his parents would pay for what they did. After the trial, my father and I walked out of the courthouse. "I'm sorry, Dad, for not listening to you," I said, tears in my eyes. He hugged me. "It's okay, Hannah. You thought you were in love. We all make mistakes." As we walked, I realized this was more than just a trial. It was a lesson in trust, a hard-earned understanding of the world's harsh realities. I had been naive, but now I was wiser, stronger. My father's car pulled up, and before I got in, I looked back at the courthouse. This chapter of my life was closed, but a new one was beginning. A chapter where I would be more cautious, more aware of people's true intentions.
I always felt a flutter of nerves whenever we visited David's family. It wasn't that they weren't welcoming, far from it. David's parents, Martha and George, were the epitome of warmth, and his brother Mike could always be counted on for a good laugh. But then there was Laura, Mike's wife, the proverbial thorn in my side. As David and I drove to his parents' house for the usual Sunday dinner, I couldn't help but voice my concerns. "David, are you sure it's okay that I come along today? I don't want to create any tension, especially with Laura around." David glanced at me, his eyes softening. "Chloe, your family. They all adore you. As for Laura, just try to ignore her snide remarks, okay?" I nodded, trying to brush aside the unease. David parked the car, and we made our way to the front door, greeted by the familiar, comforting aroma of roast beef and homemade apple pie. As we entered, Martha's face lit up. "Chloe, David, you're here. Come in, come in." George followed suit, his hearty laugh filling the room as he enveloped us in bear hugs. "How's my favorite daughter-in-law and soon-to-be lawyer?" Before I could reply, Mike bounded over, his usual playful self. "Hey, sis, ready for another round of family madness?" I laughed, the tension easing a bit. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Then, from the living room, Laura's voice cut through the air, tinged with her typical mix of indifference and sarcasm. "Oh, look, the happy couple finally graces us with their presence." I forced a smile, meeting her gaze. "Hi, Laura, good to see you too." Dinner was served, and the conversation flowed easily at first, everyone catching up on the week's events. Laura, however, seemed to be in a particularly prickly mood. "So, Chloe, still trying to play house with David? I mean, with your career and all, isn't that a bit too traditional for you?" she asked, a smirk playing on her lips. David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent gesture of support. I took a deep breath. "Well, Laura, we all make choices that suit us best. I believe in balancing career and family." Laura snorted. "Balancing, right. As if having kids doesn't totally derail your life." Mike, trying to diffuse the tension, chimed in with a chuckle. "Oh, come on, Laura, a little niece or nephew would be a joy, wouldn't it?" Laura rolled her eyes dramatically. "Joy? More like a lifetime of hassle." But hey, if Chloe wants to pop out a few kids and live the suburban dream, who am I to judge? I could feel the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. George, ever the peacemaker, attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere. "So, David, how's that new project going at work? You were telling me about it last week." David launched into a description of his latest venture, but I could barely focus. Laura's comments had struck a nerve, and I spent the rest of the meal in a daze. It was a cool autumn evening, and the family had gathered at Martha and George's for dinner. This time, the air was filled with an extra buzz of excitement. David and I had a special announcement to make, and I was both nervous and thrilled. As we sat around the dinner table laden with Martha's famous pot roast and mashed potatoes, I exchanged a glance with David. He gave me an encouraging nod. It was now or never. Everyone, we have some news," I began, my voice slightly trembling. All eyes turned to us. Martha leaned forward, her expression expectant. "What is it, dear?" David took my hand, beaming. "We're expecting a baby." There was a moment of stunned silence, then the room erupted in cheers and congratulations. Martha and George were beaming. "Oh, my goodness! That's wonderful news!" Martha exclaimed, getting up to hug us. George clapped David on the back. "Congratulations, son. I'm so proud of you both." Mike hooped, his grin wide. "I'm going to be an uncle. That's awesome." Amidst the joy and excitement, Laura sat back, a smirk playing on her lips. "A baby, huh? Well, that's going to be a handful. Good luck with that." Her tone was laced with condescension, but I tried not to let it bother me. I was too happy. Martha frowned at Laura's comment. "Laura, dear, it's a joyous occasion." Laura shrugged, nonchalantly picking at her food. sure, joyous. Until the sleepless nights and diaper changes kick in. Mike, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. Oh, Laura, don't be such a pessimist. It's going to be great, right, Chloe? I smiled, determined to keep the atmosphere positive. Absolutely, Mike. We're really excited. The conversation eventually moved on, but Laura's words lingered in my mind. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension amidst my happiness. As the evening wound down, George raised his glass for a toast. To David and Chloe, and the new addition to our family. Glasses clinked, and everyone echoed, to David and Chloe. These words warmed my heart. Despite Laura's attitude, our joy couldn't be dampened. This was the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, and nothing was going to take that away from us. The excitement of our announcement soon gave way to the harsh realities of pregnancy. My mornings, afternoons, and evenings became a nauseating roller coaster. I could hardly keep anything down, and even the smell of my once favorite foods made my stomach churn. During one of these tough days, David and I were at his parents' for dinner again. I was trying to nibble on some toast, my only safe food these days. David was rubbing my back, trying to comfort me. Chloe, you sure you don't want to try some soup? Mom made it just how you like it, David suggested gently. I shook my head weakly. No, thanks, David. Just the smell is making me queasy. Martha looked at me with concern. Poor dear, this pregnancy seems to be really taking a toll on you. Laura, who had been watching with a disinterested look, chimed in with her usual lack of empathy. Well, what did you expect, Chloe? Pregnancy isn't a walk in the park. You wanted a baby, so now deal with it. I clenched my jaw, trying to maintain my composure. David's expression hardened. Laura, that's enough. Can't you see she's struggling? Laura rolled her eyes. Oh please, David. I'm just stating the facts. She should have thought about this before. George, trying to defuse the situation, interjected. Laura, let's keep the dinner pleasant, please. Mike, who had been silent, finally spoke up, his tone a mix of annoyance and concern. Laura, can't you just lay off for once? Chloe's doing her best. Laura scoffed, pushing her chair back. I'm just being realistic. You all are just babying her. In my opinion, she's just overreacting. It's just a little morning sickness. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the stress and hormones getting the better of me. David stood up, his chair scraping back loudly. That's it. We're leaving. Chloe doesn't need this right now. As David helped me up, Martha came over, her eyes filled with apology. I'm so sorry, Chloe. Don't mind Laura, dear. We said our goodbyes quickly, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness as we left. The car ride home was quiet, the tension from dinner lingering in the air. As we drove home, I couldn't shake off Laura's words. They echoed in my mind, amplifying my fears and insecurities. But deep down, I knew I had to stay strong, for the sake of our baby. The day finally arrived when David and I welcomed our son, Ethan, into the world. It was a moment of pure joy, overshadowing all the hardships of the past months. We decided to introduce Ethan to the family at Martha and George's place, a neutral ground where everyone could share our happiness. As we entered the house, Ethan cradled in my arms, the family's reactions were everything I hoped for. Martha's eyes lit up, and George's broad smile was like a beacon of warmth. Mike was practically bouncing with excitement. Oh, my stars, he's just perfect. Martha cooed, gently touching Ethan's tiny hand. George leaned in, his voice gentle. Welcome to the world, little fella. Mike was next, his voice full of awe. Hey there, little guy. I'm your Uncle Mike. Ready to cause some trouble together? Their reactions filled my heart to the brim. But then, there was Laura. She hung back, a sour expression on her face. When she finally approached, her words were like a cold splash of water. "Well, that's a baby, alright. Kinda looks a bit weird, though. All red and wrinkly." The room went silent. Martha's face turned into a frown, and George's eyes narrowed. David's arm instinctively tightened around me. "Excuse me?" Martha said, her tone icy. "What did you just say about my grandson?" Laura shrugged, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm just saying, he's not exactly cute, is he? Looks kind of scary to me." I felt a sting at her words, and David stepped in, his voice tight. "That's enough, Laura. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all." Mike looked at Laura, disbelief written all over his face. "Laura, what's wrong with you? That's your nephew." Laura rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Everyone's thinking it, I'm just the only one saying it." Martha stepped closer to Laura, her eyes flashing. "Your behavior is disgusting, Laura. If you can't be happy for Chloe and David, maybe you should leave." Laura scoffed, crossing her arms. "Fine. If I'm not welcome, then I'll go. But don't expect me to fawn over a baby like everyone else." With that, she stormed out of the house, leaving a trail of shock and discomfort behind her. The joyous atmosphere had been tainted, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. A few months had passed since Ethan's introduction to the family, and things had been relatively calm. David and I were adjusting to parenthood, albeit with the usual sleepless nights and endless diaper changes. That sense of normalcy was shattered one afternoon when Laura unexpectedly showed up at our doorstep. I opened the door to find her standing there, an odd, frantic look in her eyes. "Laura? What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised. "Chloe, I need a favor, a big one," she blurted out, her voice tinged with desperation. I was wary but curious. "Okay, what is it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes darting around. "I need to borrow Ethan. Just for a little while." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Borrow Ethan? What on earth for?" She began pacing, speaking rapidly. "It's my grandmother, see? She's old, doesn't have much time left. She told me she's leaving most of her estate to the first grandchild who has a baby. I thought maybe I could pass Ethan off as mine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want to pretend my son is yours? Are you insane?" Laura stopped pacing, turning to face me. "It's just for a day, Chloe. My grandmother's not all there anymore. She won't know the difference." Anger bubbled up inside me. "You want to deceive your dying grandmother with my child? That's sick, Laura." She clenched her fists, her voice rising. "You don't understand, Chloe. This could change my life. It's a lot of money we're talking about." I shook my head, disbelief and anger mingling. "I don't care how much money it is. I'm not going to help you lie, especially not with my baby." Laura's face contorted with frustration. "You're being selfish, Chloe. You have no idea what I'm going through." I stood my ground, my voice firm. "And you have no idea what being a mother means." "The answer is no, Laura. Now, I think you should leave." She glared at me, her body tense. "You're going to regret this, Chloe. You just wait and see." With that, Laura stormed off, leaving me standing there, shocked and shaking. I closed the door slowly, my mind racing. The audacity of her request was beyond comprehension. I knew then that Laura was capable of going to extreme lengths for her own benefit, and that realization chilled me to the bone. I called David immediately, recounting the bizarre encounter. He was just as shocked and angry as I was. "She's lost it, Chloe. Just stay away from her, okay? I don't want her anywhere near you or Ethan." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I will. This is just It's too much. After hanging up, I went to check on Ethan, sleeping peacefully in his crib, blissfully unaware of the insanity of the world around him. I promised myself then and there that I would protect him from any harm, no matter what. Laura's bizarre request had opened my eyes to the lengths she would go to, and I knew I had to be vigilant. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon, and Ethan was taking his nap in his nursery upstairs. I was in the kitchen, trying to catch up on some chores, when the doorbell rang. It was a courier with a delivery of baby supplies I had ordered online. The exchange took less than a minute. But when I returned inside and headed upstairs to check on Ethan, my heart dropped to my stomach. The crib was empty. Ethan was gone. Panic surged through me. "Ethan! Ethan!" I called out, my voice trembling as I frantically searched the room. There was no response, no sign of him anywhere. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed David's number. "David, Ethan's gone. He's not in his crib, he's not anywhere." I cried out as soon as he answered. "What? What do you mean gone? Are you sure he's not somewhere in the house?" David's voice was laced with panic. "I've looked everywhere. He's not here, David. Someone took him." I was on the verge of hysteria. David's voice was firm, trying to stay calm for both of us. "Okay, Chloe, call the police right now. I'm leaving the office, I'll be there as soon as I can." I hung up and dialed 911, my voice breaking as I explained the situation to the operator. Within minutes, police cars arrived, their sirens piercing the quiet neighborhood. As the officers began their investigation, David rushed in, his face pale with fear. "Chloe, tell me everything. What happened?" I recounted the events, from the courier's visit to the chilling discovery of Ethan's empty crib. As I spoke, a horrible thought struck me. Laura, she threatened me, after I refused to let her take Ethan. David's face hardened. "I'll kill her if she's done anything to him." The police overheard and immediately took note. "We need to know everything about this Laura. Address, description, everything," one of the officers said. As we provided Laura's details, Martha and George arrived, faces etched with worry. Martha embraced me, her own tears mingling with mine. Just then, Mike burst through the door, his eyes wild with worry. "What's going on? I heard Ethan's missing." Before we could answer, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went white. "It's Laura," he answered, his voice shaking. "Laura, where are you? Do you know anything about Ethan?" The room fell silent, everyone's eyes on Mike. He listened for a moment, his expression turning from worry to shock and then to anger. "You did what? Laura, how could you?" He hung up, his body trembling with rage. "She took him. She's at her grandmother's, trying to pass Ethan off as her own." The police officer sprang into action, coordinating with their team to track Laura down. David held me close, his body rigid with anger and fear. David, Mike, and I were in a state of high alert as we drove to Laura's grandmother's house. The tension in the car was palpable, each of us lost in our own turmoil of anger and worry. As we approached the house, my heart pounded against my chest, a mix of fear and desperate hope. Mike was on his phone, coordinating with the police. "They're on their way. We just need to keep her there until they arrive." We pulled up to the house, and without a second thought, we rushed inside. The scene that greeted us was surreal. Laura was there, holding Ethan in her arms, cooing at him as if he were her own. Her grandmother, a frail, confused-looking woman, was watching them with a faint smile. The moment Laura saw us, her face went white. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, clutching Ethan closer. "Give me my son, Laura," I shouted, my voice filled with a mixture of rage and relief at seeing Ethan. David was right beside me, his eyes fixed on Ethan, You're done, Laura. The police are on their way. Laura's grandmother looked around, confusion written all over her face. What's going on? Laura, who are these people? Before Laura could respond, Mike stepped forward, his voice filled with disgust. These are Ethan's real parents, Grandma. Laura took him, pretending he was hers. The old woman's eyes widened in shock. What? Laura, is this true? Laura's facade finally crumbled. Tears started streaming down her face. I just wanted the inheritance, Grandma. I didn't think it would go this far. Her grandmother shook her head, disappointment etched on her face. Laura, how could you? This is unforgivable. By now, Ethan had started to fuss, sensing the tension. I reached out, and Laura, defeated, handed him over to me. Holding Ethan close, feeling his warmth and hearing his familiar sounds, was the most comforting feeling in the world after the terror of the last few hours. You're sick, Laura, David said, his voice cold. You need help. Laura was sobbing now, her body shaking. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Just then, the police arrived, their presence filling the room. They immediately went to Laura, reading her rights as they handcuffed her. As we left Laura's grandmother's house, the police leading Laura away, a wave of relief washed over me. Ethan was safe in my arms, unharmed by the ordeal. In the weeks that followed, our lives were a whirlwind of police statements and court dates. The reality of what Laura had done was sinking in, not just for us, but for the entire family. David and I were sitting in the living room one evening after putting Ethan to bed, the silence between us filled with unspoken thoughts. David finally broke the silence. Chloe, I can't believe she's actually going to jail for this. I nodded, still processing everything. I know. It's just. I feel so betrayed, David. She was family. David reached for my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She crossed a line, Chloe. What she did was unforgivable. But we need to focus on moving forward, for Ethan's sake. The trial had been swift. Laura's actions were indefensible, and she was sentenced to several years in prison for kidnapping. Mike had filed for divorce, a decision that had shaken him deeply. A few days later, we were at Martha and George's house. The family had gathered, a sense of somber unity in the air. Martha was the first to speak as we all sat in the living room. I just can't believe she would do something like this. To her own family, she said, her voice heavy with sadness. George nodded, his brow furrowed. It's a hard pill to swallow. But we have to think about the kids now, about Ethan. Mike sat quietly, his eyes distant. I feel like I didn't know her at all. How could I have been so blind? David put a hand on his brother's shoulder. You couldn't have known, Mike. None of us could. The conversation turned to how we could all support each other. It was clear that the family bond had been tested, but not broken. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Ethan was growing fast, his smiles and laughter a constant reminder of the joy he brought into our lives. The ordeal with Laura had left its mark, but it had also made us stronger, more appreciative of the love and support we had for each other. One evening, as I watched Ethan play, I realized that this experience had taught me about the resilience of family, the strength of love, and the power of moving forward, no matter how difficult the past might have been. We had faced our darkest hour, but we had emerged stronger, united by our love for each other and for our son. The future was uncertain, but I knew that as long as we were together, we could face anything. Life had a funny way of unfolding in our small, suburban corner of the world. I, Nancy, navigated the steady ebb and flow of life as a bank teller, while my husband, Tom, managed the intricate dance of municipal politics. Our home was a testament to Tom's family, a house passed down through generations, now echoing with the remnants of our conversations and debates. It was a typical Thursday evening, and I was rummaging through the kitchen, prepping for dinner, The aroma of cooking filled the air, a small comfort in the otherwise silent house. "Tom, dinner's nearly ready," I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls. He strolled into the kitchen, his face buried in the day's mail. Smells good. What's the occasion?" His voice carried a hint of sarcasm, typical after a long day at the office. "Just trying to keep things interesting," I replied, setting the table. "You know, spice up our routine." Tom smirked, dropping the pile of envelopes on the counter. "Routine is good, Nancy. Keeps things predictable." That was Tom, always preferring the predictable, the controlled, and the comfortable. I often wondered what ran through his mind as he sifted through city issues, what dreams he chased within the confines of his calculated world. As we sat down to eat, the conversation drifted to mundane things, the leaky faucet, the Jones' new car, and the upcoming city council meeting. It was all so painfully normal until the mention of my family. "So, your nephew's coming this weekend?" Tom asked, his fork pausing midair. "Yeah, they are. Bobby's got a soccer game nearby. Thought they'd crash here afterward," I replied, trying to gauge his reaction. Tom's face hardened slightly. "Great, more chaos. Just what we need." "Oh, come on, Tom. They're just kids. Plus, it's nice having family around, don't you think?" I chided, hoping to lighten his mood. "Family's fine in small doses. But your brother's kids, they run around like wild animals. And that farm smell seems to follow them here." His words stung, an all too frequent reminder of the life I left behind and the world he never understood or cared to. "They're just excited, Tom. And they're my family." "They're part of me," I said firmly, my patience waning. Tom sighed, putting down his fork. I know. But can't they just tone it down a bit?" I shook my head, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "They're kids, Tom. They don't tone it down. That's what kids do. They play, they laugh, they make noise." The rest of the meal passed in a tense silence, the clinking of cutlery against plates filling the void between us. It was in these moments that I felt the distance growing, the gap widening between his world and mine. The morning buzzed with the usual flurry of activity, the kind that fills every working household. I was gulping down my coffee, already running through the day's tasks in my head, when my phone rang. It was an unusual time for a call, and seeing my brother's name flash on the screen sent a ripple of worry through me. "Hey, Jake, what's up?" I answered, trying to keep my voice even. "Nancy, it's Dad. He's sick, real sick." Jake's voice was strained, each word heavy with concern. I felt the air leave the room, my hand tightening around the phone. "What do you mean sick? What's happened?" "He's got cancer, Nancy. It's bad. The doctors are talking all sorts of treatments, but it's gonna cost a fortune." Jake's voice broke, the reality of our situation setting in. My mind raced, thoughts of Dad, the farm, and those childhood days flooding back. Okay. Let's figure this out. How much are we talking about? I can help." I could hear the hesitation in Jake's voice. "It's a lot, Nancy. More than any of us got. They're talking about treatments, chemo, maybe more. It's all just a lot." My heart ached, an overwhelming urge to fix it all taking hold. "I'll talk to Tom. We can use some savings, maybe get a loan. We'll find a way." With a heavy heart, I hung up and turned to find Tom standing in the doorway, a questioning look on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a casual concern. I took a deep breath, the weight of the news anchoring me to the spot. "It's my dad. He's sick, really sick. Cancer. It's bad, Tom." Tom's expression shifted, the news landing with a thud. "Jesus, Nancy. I'm sorry. What do you need?" "We need money for treatment. A lot of it." "I want to help, Tom. I need to help," I said, the words tumbling out, a mix of desperation and determination. Tom ran a hand through his hair, the gears turning. Money, huh? That's gonna be tight. But, okay, we'll look at our finances, see what we can do. I nodded, the first wave of relief washing over me. Thank you. I knew I could count on you. The rest of the morning was a blur, calls to the hospital, more conversations with Jake, and a deep dive into our savings account. The numbers swirled before me, daunting yet necessary. This was family, and nothing was too big or too hard when it came to family. The day Dad arrived at our place was one I'd been dreading and longing for in equal measure. Tom had been oddly agreeable about Dad staying with us, which should have been my first clue that something was off. As soon as Dad's car pulled into the driveway, I rushed out, my heart aching at the sight of him. He was a shell of the robust man I remembered, his frame hunched, his face drawn with pain and weariness. "Nancy, my girl," he said, his voice weak but filled with warmth as I helped him inside. Tom came out to greet us, his smile a little too stiff, a little too forced. "Welcome, Mr. Williams. Let me show you to your room." The evening passed in a sort of anxious dance, Dad trying to appear stronger than he was, Tom playing the gracious host, and me, caught in the middle, worrying about everything unsaid. As we sat down to dinner, a heavy silence enveloped the table. Tom was the first to break it, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "So, Mr. Williams, I've been thinking about your situation. I want to help, really I do." Dad nodded, a wary look in his eyes. "That's kind of you, Tom. I appreciate all the support. But," Tom continued, "I think it's only fair we discuss some terms." Terms? My stomach twisted at the word, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. "What do you mean, Tom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked between Dad and me, his gaze calculating. "Well, it's simple really. I'll cover the medical expenses, allow you to stay here, but in return, I want the farm. All of it, transferred to me and Nancy." I stared at him, disbelief and anger churning inside me. "Are you serious right now? You can't be serious." Dad's expression hardened, his tired eyes suddenly alight with a spark of the old fire. "You want my land, my home, in exchange for helping me? It's a fair deal, don't you think?" Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "A small price to pay for your health and comfort." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my husband, the man I'd vowed to spend my life with, and he was bargaining over my father's life like it was a business transaction. "Tom, you can't do this. It's not right. It's disgusting," I spat out, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Dad pushed his chair back, his body trembling with a mix of rage and effort. "I don't want your money, Tom. Not like this. I'd rather die than give you everything I've worked for." The room spun around me, the walls closing in. This was a nightmare, a terrible, heartless game, and Tom was revealing himself to be the villain. "Fine," Tom said, his voice cold. "Then you leave. Both of you. I won't be taken for a fool." With that, Dad grabbed his cane, his pride the only thing keeping him upright. I followed, my mind a whirlwind of hurt, anger, and disbelief. "Tom, I can't believe you. I won't let you do this to my family," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't respond, his face set in a mask of indifference. We packed a few things, Dad's weak protests echoing in my ears. This was it. The facade had crumbled, and the man I thought I knew had vanished, replaced by a stranger with cold eyes and a colder heart. We didn't speak much on the drive to the small rental I'd managed to find on short notice. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over our heads, a place to regroup and figure out our next steps. Once inside, I helped Dad to the couch, his body sinking into the cushions with a weary sigh. "Nancy, I'm sorry. I never should have put you in this position," he murmured, his eyes downcast. "No, Dad. Don't you dare apologize. This is on Tom, not you." "I can't believe he'd do something like this," I replied, my voice fierce with anger. Dad shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. And to think I almost considered it, for a moment, to make sure you'd be taken care of. That's exactly why I'm doing all this, Dad. You took care of me my whole life. It's my turn now, I said, squeezing his hand. The following days were a blur of doctor's appointments, phone calls, and late-night internet searches for any financial aid we might qualify for. I was running on adrenaline and coffee, determined to find a way to afford Dad's treatment. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I came back to the rental to find Dad sitting at the small kitchen table, a stack of bills in front of him. Nancy, sit down. We need to talk about this. Realistically, he said, his voice steady but tired. I pulled up a chair, my stomach in knots. What is it, Dad? He pushed the bills toward me, his finger tapping on the total amount due. This is more than you can handle, Nancy. I can't let you ruin your life for me. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. Dad, I'm not having this conversation. I'll find a way. We'll find a way. Together. Dad reached across the table, his rough hand covering mine. Nancy, listen to me. I've lived a good life. I've seen you grow into a remarkable woman. If it's my time, then so be it. But you have so much more to live for. Don't let this destroy you. I shook my head, pulling my hand away. No. I refuse to accept that. We're going to fight this, Dad. Until the very end. The determination in my voice seemed to give Dad a small spark of hope, or perhaps he just didn't have the heart to argue any further. We spent the rest of the evening in a quiet, mutual understanding, both of us too stubborn and too scared to consider giving up. Days turned into weeks, and despite the ever-present shadow of illness and financial strain, we found small moments of joy, old stories retold, laughter shared over simple meals, and quiet evenings watching whatever was on TV. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and for the moment, it was enough. 3 months had flown by in a blur of hospital visits, a relentless battle against the merciless tide of illness. Despite our best efforts and boundless hope, my father's condition deteriorated under the weight of the aggressive cancer. It was a losing fight, but one we endured together, with the stubbornness and heart that characterized our simple, hardworking family. My father's passing was quiet, a gentle surrender in the early hours of a gray morning. The pain of losing him was sharp, a raw wound that seemed to echo through the empty spaces of our rented home. The funeral was a somber affair, filled with hushed voices and tear-stained faces, a final goodbye to a man who had been the bedrock of our family. After the guests had left, the condolences spoken, and the last of the dishes put away, I sat with my brother, Jake, on the porch of our family home. The air was heavy with unspoken words, a shared grief hanging between us. Emma, he was so proud of you. We both are. You did everything you could. I nodded, the weight of grief a tangible thing on my shoulders. I just wish it could have been different. Jake hugged me, and we stood there, in the fading light, saying goodbye to our father, to a part of our lives that we'd never get back. The days after the funeral were heavy and quiet, filled with the kind of emptiness that follows a storm. I spent long hours staring at the land, our land, stretching out with rows of corn and the old oak tree standing tall against the skyline. It was more than just soil and crops, it was Dad's legacy, a testament to his life's work. Jake and I had been going through Dad's papers, trying to sort out his affairs, when I stumbled upon a series of letters and notes. They were inquiries and offers on the land, some dated back a few months, others more recent. Each one hinted at the value of the land, suggesting it was set to skyrocket with the city's expansion plans. Jake, look at this, I called out, my hand trembling slightly as I held out the papers. He came over, his eyes scanning the documents quickly. What the hell? These offers are huge, Nancy. And they're all pretty recent. I nodded, the pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place. It makes sense now. This is why Tom was so eager to get his hands on the land. He knew about this, somehow. He knew and tried to use Dad's illness to pressure us into signing it over. Jake's face darkened, a mix of anger and disbelief etched into his features. That snake. Using our own dad's sickness for his gain. We've got to do something about this, Nancy. I agreed, the fire of determination igniting within me. We will. We'll make sure this land stays in the family, just like Dad wanted. And as for Tom, he's going to regret ever trying to cheat us. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. We met with lawyers, talked to the city planners, and started to piece together a plan. The land was indeed about to become very valuable, and we were determined to protect it, to ensure it benefited the family and honored Dad's memory. But as we dug deeper, the reality of the situation became clear. We were up against more than just greedy land speculators. We were dealing with a network of information and influence, and at the center of it all was Tom. One evening, as Jake and I sat exhausted from another day of meetings and calls, the phone rang. It was Tom, his voice smooth and eerily calm. Nancy, we need to talk. I've been hearing things about the land. I think we can come to an agreement, something beneficial for both of us. I felt a surge of disgust listening to him, the man I had once loved, now nothing more than a conniving stranger. There's nothing to talk about, Tom. You tried to cheat my family, to take advantage of my father's death. You're not getting a single inch of that land, I replied, my voice steely and resolute. Tom let out a dry laugh. Nancy, don't be naive. This is business. I was just trying to secure our future, our wealth. Let's meet, discuss this like adults. I clenched the phone tighter, the anger boiling inside me. The only business I'll be discussing with you is the divorce. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Tom. Goodbye. The days following my final conversation with Tom were fraught with a tense anticipation. Jake and I had enlisted a sharp-witted lawyer, Mr. Henderson, who specialized in estate and property law. He was a no-nonsense type, with a keen eye for detail and a deep understanding of the underhanded tactics used by those looking to exploit others. We sat in Mr. Henderson's office, the walls lined with legal tomes and certificates, as he laid out the strategy. Now, Nancy and Jake, I've seen this type of thing before. Wealthy individuals trying to cash in on insider information. It's illegal and immoral. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. I nodded, my resolve hardening. What do we need to do? I want to make sure Tom pays for what he tried to do. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses, his eyes sharp. First, we gather all the evidence. The offers on the land, the communications from Tom, anything that can show his intent and knowledge of the land's value. Jake leaned forward, his brow furrowed. We've got plenty of that. Emails, letters, even some voicemails he left Nancy. Good, Mr. Henderson replied, that's a start. Next, we file for an injunction to prevent any sale or transfer of the land until this is resolved. That will protect your asset. The next few weeks were a blur of legal motions, affidavits, and tense waiting. Tom, it seemed, was not going down without a fight. His own lawyers were pushing back, painting him as an innocent party, just trying to take care of his sick father-in-law. But we had the truth on our side, and slowly, the evidence began to pile up against him. The turning point came when one of Tom's associates, caught up in another investigation, decided to turn state's evidence, providing a direct link between Tom and the speculators looking to buy the land. The day we received the news, Jake and I met at the local diner, a spot we'd come to frequent for its strong coffee and quiet corners. Nancy, this is it. This guy's testimony is going to nail Tom. He's not getting out of this, Jake said, a hint of triumph in his voice. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness a match for my mood. Good. He deserves everything that's coming to him. I just wish it hadn't come to this, you know? Jake reached across the table, his hand covering mine. I know, sis. But you're doing the right thing. Protecting the land, our family. It's what Dad would have wanted. The trial was a spectacle, the media latching onto the story of a local official caught in a web of greed and deceit. Tom's face was plastered on every news outlet, the details of his scheming laid bare for all to see. And when the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, but sadness for the man I had once loved, now just a shadow of his former self. The courthouse steps were behind us, the weight of months of legal battles lifted. I took a deep breath, the air tasting fresher, sweeter somehow. Jake and I walked in silence, each lost in thought, until we reached the old diner that had become our haven. Sliding into the booth, the familiar clatter of dishes and murmur of conversation wrapped around us like a comforting blanket. Jake ordered us coffee, and we sat, the steam curling up between us. "You know, Nancy, I think this is the first time I've seen you look relaxed in months," Jake said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I laughed, a genuine, light sound that felt foreign after all this time. "Yeah, it's over, isn't it? I can finally move on, start fresh." He nodded, his eyes warm. "You've got a whole new life ahead of you, sis. What's the plan?" I stirred my coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug. "Well, I've been thinking. I want to do something with the land. Not sell it off or anything, but maybe start a community garden, or a space for kids to learn about farming. Something that would make Dad proud." Jake's eyes lit up, enthusiasm radiating from him. "That's a fantastic idea, Nancy. You always had a knack for dreaming big. I'm in, whatever you need." We spent the next hour talking excitedly about the possibilities, the dream taking shape between us. It felt good, right, to be planning for the future instead of reeling from the past. As we left the diner, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning. I made my way to the small apartment I'd called home since leaving Tom. It was modest, but it was mine, a sanctuary from the world outside. Opening the door, I stepped inside, the quiet enveloping me. I wandered over to the window, the view stretching out to the city skyline in the distance. The land, our land, lay between here and there, a green expanse filled with potential and promise. The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. I picked it up, a familiar voice on the other end. "Hey, Emma, it's Lucy, from the bank. I heard about everything, and I just wanted to say, if you need anything, we're all here for you." I smiled, touched by the offer. "Thanks, Lucy. I appreciate it. Actually, there might be something. I'm thinking of starting a project on the land, something community-focused. Maybe the bank could be a part of it?" Lucy's excitement was palpable, even through the phone. "Absolutely, Emma. That sounds amazing. Let's set up a meeting, talk about what you need. We'd love to be involved." Hanging up, I felt a surge of excitement. The project was more than just a dream now, it was a possibility, a real, tangible future. I sat down, a small notebook and pen in hand, and began to jot down ideas, plans, names. The page filled up quickly, a testament to the flurry of thoughts and hopes swirling through my mind. It was a new beginning, not just for me, but for the community, for the legacy of the land. And as I wrote, I could almost feel Dad's presence, his quiet strength and unwavering support guiding me forward. The path ahead was uncharted, filled with challenges and opportunities, but I was ready. Ready to build, to grow, and to thrive. This was more than just a new chapter, it was a whole new book, and I was the author, pen in hand, ready to write a story of hope, perseverance, and renewal. The end was just the beginning. My name's Sarah, a 29-year-old accountant with a knack for numbers and a love for a well-balanced budget. I'm married to Alex, a man whose sense of humor is as strong as his love for me. We live in a small, well-appointed apartment I inherited and spruced up over the years. It's our little haven, filled with the laughter and love of a young, happy couple. One lazy Sunday, as I was reconciling some accounts, Alex lounged on the sofa, chuckling at something on his phone. "Hey, money wizard, any chance you can conjure up a feast for lunch?" he joked, looking up at me with a grin. Rolling my eyes, I replied, "With your spending habits? I'd need real magic for that." Our banter was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Mrs. Thompson, Alex's mother, standing at the doorstep with her usual air of disdain hidden poorly behind a strained smile. "Hello, dear," she greeted, her eyes immediately scanning the apartment. "Hi, Mom," Alex said, getting up to hug her. "What brings you here today?" "Oh, just wanted to see how you two are managing in this tiny place," she replied, her voice dripping with a tone that suggested she found our living situation pitiable. I bit my tongue, offering a polite smile. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. Thompson?" As I set about making coffee, I overheard their conversation from the kitchen. Mrs. Thompson was lamenting her financial difficulties, the costs of maintaining her large, old house apparently overwhelming her. "It's just so much, Alex. I don't know how I'll manage," she sighed dramatically. Alex looked concerned. "Mom, we can help out. Maybe we can give you some money each month, help ease the burden?" My heart sank. We were doing well, but we weren't wealthy. Still, the thought of his mother struggling was enough for Alex to offer. I brought in the coffee, sitting down as they discussed figures. $1,000 a month? Alex suggested, looking over at me for approval. I nodded, masking my concern. "If it helps, Mrs. Thompson, we're happy to help." She accepted with a quick, almost too eager nod. "You're such good children. I don't know what I'd do without you." Yet, as she sipped her coffee, her eyes lingered on the renovated kitchen, the sleek appliances, and the comfortable furniture. "Of course, if you could afford such nice things for yourselves, maybe you could spare a little more," she mused, her voice trailing off suggestively. Alex was about to speak, but I cut in. "We'll start with the 1,000 and see how things go. We have to be mindful of our own expenses, after all." Mrs. Thompson seemed a bit put off, but covered it with a tight smile. "Of course, dear. I appreciate anything you can do." After she left, Alex and I sat in a heavy silence. "Are we doing the right thing?" he finally asked, his brows furrowed in worry. I reached for his hand. "We're helping your mom, that's important. But let's not dive into deep waters we can't swim out of, okay?" He squeezed my hand back, the weight of our decision settling in. "Okay," he agreed, but I could tell the matter wasn't settled in his heart. The rest of the day passed quietly, with both of us lost in our thoughts. The air in the apartment felt different now, charged with the responsibility we had taken on and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Thompson's visit was just the beginning of a larger challenge we would face together. But whatever it was, we'd face it as a team, as we always did. Weeks after Mrs. Thompson's visit, the routine of our life resumed, the uneasy feeling of the financial commitment lingering like a stubborn fog. Then, out of the blue, we got news that turned our world upside down. I was pregnant. The joy was overwhelming. Alex's face lit up like a Christmas tree when I told him, his laughter echoing in the apartment. "We're going to be parents, Sarah." "Can you believe it?" he exclaimed, lifting me in a whirlwind hug. Laughing and a bit dizzy, I replied, "Believe it? I'm already planning the budget for baby shoes and college." The news of the baby brought a new wave of visits from Mrs. Thompson. One evening, she arrived with an unusual spark in her eye. "I have a proposal for you too," she began, settling herself on the sofa as if preparing for a long discussion. Alex and I exchanged a look, trepidation mixing with curiosity. "What kind of proposal?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's simple. You need more space for the baby, and I need less of a burden. I move in with my daughter, and you move into my house," she declared, her voice carrying a note of finality. I choked on my tea. "Move in, to your house?" The image of her large, run-down home flashed in my mind, the creaky floors and peeling paint a stark contrast to our cozy apartment. Alex, ever the optimist, chimed in. That's an idea, Mom. But Sarah's right. Your house needs a lot of work. Undeterred, Mrs. Thompson continued. Think of it, Alex. Your child can grow up in the house you did. And with Sarah's knack for budgeting, you can turn it into something beautiful. I could see Alex's eyes soften at the thought, the sentimental value of his childhood home pulling at him. But practicality nipped at my mind. It's a big decision, Mrs. Thompson. And a big project. We need to think it over, discuss the costs, the work. But she was on a roll. You won't get a better offer. Space for the baby, a family home. It's perfect. Think fast, though. I don't want to be a burden on my daughter for long. The conversation spun around us, Alex caught in memories and possibilities, Mrs. Thompson pressing her point, and me, trying to anchor it all in reality. We'll talk it over, I finally said, cutting through the chatter. We need time to decide what's best for our family. After she left, the apartment felt too small, the walls closing in with the weight of her proposal. Alex paced, torn between nostalgia and the reality of the massive undertaking. Sarah, it could be great, right? The baby, the house. But it's a lot, he said, running his hands through his hair. I took his hands, steadying him. Let's sleep on it. Make lists, pros and cons. We do this right, or not at all. He nodded, the worry lines easing a bit. You're right. As always. Let's figure this out together. That night, sleep was elusive, the future a jumble of cribs and construction. But as I lay there, listening to Alex's steady breathing, I knew whatever decision we made, we'd face the consequences, good or bad, as one. The thought was a small comfort in the sea of uncertainty that Mrs. Thompson's unexpected proposal had plunged us into. After many sleepless nights and endless discussions, Alex and I decided to take on the challenge. The prospect of creating a loving home for our baby in his childhood house won over the daunting task ahead. All right, let's do this. But we're doing it our way, no cutting corners, I declared one morning, determination firm in my voice. Alex smiled, his usual optimism shining through. That's my girl. It'll be our project, our home. The house stood as I remembered, large and looming, its once grand features now dulled by time and neglect. As we walked through the creaking doors, the reality of what we'd taken on hit me. What have we gotten ourselves into? I murmured, more to myself than to Alex. He wrapped an arm around me. Hey, it's going to be great. A bit of paint here, some new floors there. I raised an eyebrow. And the plumbing, electrics, heating. My voice trailed off as the list grew longer in my mind. We brought in a designer, Tom, a friend known for his practical yet stylish eye. Okay, let's see what we've got, Tom said, clipboard in hand, ready to tackle the beast. Room by room, we assessed, planned, and budgeted. The numbers were dizzying, but every decision was made with our future in mind. The workers started, their presence a constant in the once quiet house. Dust and noise became our new normal, but with each completed task, the place began to transform. One particularly chaotic day, as I navigated through ladders and paint cans, I found Alex staring at the nursery, a soft smile on his face. Can you imagine it, Sarah? Our little one right here? I joined him, envisioning the room not as it was, but as it would be. It'll be beautiful, Alex. The perfect place for baby naps and bedtime stories. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the house began to resemble a home. The sagging ceilings were now sturdy and smooth, the walls fresh with paint. The old, grimy windows replaced with clear glass that let the light flood in. Each evening, we reviewed the progress, our excitement growing with every box ticked off the list. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Delays and unexpected repairs tested our patience and budget. Another issue? What now? I'd ask, frustration mounting as Tom relayed the latest hiccup. Plumbing's older than we thought. Needs more work, but we'll get it done, Tom would assure, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to my frazzled nerves. Despite the setbacks, we pushed forward, driven by the vision of our family in this home. And as the final touches were put in place, the house, once a daunting project, stood proud and welcoming, a testament to our hard work and love. Exhausted but elated, we stepped back, taking in the sight. We did it, Sarah. We actually did it, Alex said, his voice thick with emotion. I leaned into him, the house behind us no longer just a building, but a symbol of our new beginning. We sure did, love. Now, let's get ready to welcome our little one into it. With that, we turned and walked into our future, ready for whatever it might hold. Just as we settled into our newly renovated home, savoring the calm after months of relentless work, our world was turned upside down again. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and we were out getting some fresh air and much-needed couple time. When we turned the corner onto our street, my heart dropped. A moving truck was parked in front of our house, and men were carrying out our furniture. What the? Alex's voice trailed off as we hurried toward the chaos. As we pushed through the front door, the sight that greeted us was like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter, Carol, were there, directing the movers with an air of authority that left no room for questions. What in the world is going on here? I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mrs. Thompson turned to us, a smirk playing on her lips. Oh, Sarah, Alex, good, you're here. I've decided it's time I move back into my house. Your house? We just spent months turning this place around, not to mention the money we poured into it. Alex's voice rose, his usual calm demeanor gone. Carol chimed in, her tone just as cold as her mother's. Well, it's a family house, and we're family. It's only right we live here. Plus, think of how nice it'll be for my kids in that lovely nursery you fixed up. I felt like I was in a bad dream, the room spinning around me. But you told us to move in here. You pushed for this. We have a baby on the way, for goodness sake. Mrs. Thompson shrugged, her gaze void of any sympathy. Things change, dear. I needed a break, and you provided it. But now, it's time for you to go back to your little apartment. The reality of her words hit me like a tidal wave. All our work, all our dreams for this house, were being ripped away without a second thought. I glanced at Alex, his face a mask of shock and hurt. Mom, you can't do this. We have rights. We'll fight this, he stammered, the fight in his voice not matching the defeat in his eyes. Mrs. Thompson laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Good luck with that. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a house to settle into. We were ushered out like strangers, our belongings piled haphazardly on the lawn. The movers didn't meet our eyes, their actions mechanical and detached. As we sat amidst boxes and bags, the life we had built within those walls now locked away from us, Alex put his arm around me. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I just never imagined. I leaned into him, the tears I'd been holding back finally breaking free. It's not your fault, Alex. We were conned, plain and simple. The following days were a blur of anger, disbelief, and an unyielding sense of betrayal. We were back in our apartment, surrounded by boxes that were meant for a different life. Alex was quiet, his usual light extinguished by the shock. I was fuming, pacing the small space like a caged animal. We need to do something, Alex. We can't let them get away with this. I exclaimed, my voice sharp with frustration. Alex, looking up from the sea of papers he had been sifting through, met my gaze. I know, Sarah. And I think I have something that might help. My heart skipped a beat. What is it? He held up his phone, a determined glint in his eye. Remember the day she proposed the switch? I had recorded the conversation, just a gut feeling. It's all here, her admitting it was her house, but encouraging us to move in, to invest. I felt a surge of hope, mixed with a bitter satisfaction. That could be our leverage. We contacted a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Janet who had a reputation for being a bulldog in court. She listened intently as we relayed our story, the recording playing a pivotal role. This is good, Janet nodded after hearing the recording. It's not a straightforward case, but it's a start. We'll need more, though. Receipts, contracts, any communication about the renovations. We spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence we could find. Every receipt felt like a tiny weapon in our fight to reclaim not just the house, but our dignity and future. The day we presented our case to Janet, her office was stark and uninviting, but her focus was unwavering. "This is solid," she said, sifting through the papers. "We'll file for deception and undue influence. It's going to be a battle, but I think we have a shot." The weeks leading up to the court date were tense. We were a mix of nerves and grim determination. The thought of facing Mrs. Thompson and Carol in court made my stomach churn. On the day, as we sat in the sterile courtroom, I held Alex's hand tightly. Mrs. Thompson and Carol sat across from us, their faces masks of cool indifference. As the proceedings began, Janet was fierce, laying out our case with a precision that left no room for doubt. Mrs. Thompson's lawyer tried to counter, but the recording, the receipts, they all painted a clear picture of deceit. When it was Mrs. Thompson's turn to speak, her voice was shaky, a stark contrast to the confident, almost smug tone she had used when kicking us out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed some help, and I thought. Thank you, no further questions. Janet cut her off, turning back to the judge with a nod. The rest of the trial was a blur of legal jargon and closing arguments. As we waited for the judge to deliver his verdict, I felt Alex's hand grip mine, his palm sweaty. The judge finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, I find in favor of the plaintiffs. It is clear that there was a calculated effort to mislead and benefit from their investments. Relief flooded through me, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Alex let out a long breath, his body sagging slightly. As we walked out of the courtroom, the world seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. "We did it," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Alex pulled me into a hug, right there on the courthouse steps. "We did," he agreed, his voice steady and sure. "And now, we move forward." The battle was over, but the war had left its scars. As we started the journey back to our apartment, the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: we were stronger together, and no matter what came next, we would face it as a team. After the legal victory, the weight of the past months began to lift, but the task of truly moving on was still ahead of us. The first order of business was to clear out the house, our house, as the court had affirmed, at least in terms of the investment we'd made. Alex and I returned, not as residents, but as reclaimers of our peace and investment. We methodically removed every piece of furniture, every appliance, and even the fancy new plumbing fixtures we'd installed. Each item carried out was a chapter of our ordeal, closed and packed away. "I can't believe we're stripping the house bare," Alex said, his voice echoing in the now hollow space. "It's only what we put into it," I reminded him, my voice firm with a resolve that hadn't been there before. As we worked, Mrs. Thompson arrived, her eyes wide as she saw the shell of what had once been her home. She began to sob, her body shaking with each heave. "Please, I didn't mean for any of this. I'm so sorry. Can't we just forget all this happened?" she pleaded, her voice desperate. Alex and I exchanged a look, the shared pain and betrayal still fresh between us. "We're beyond sorry now," Alex said. "We're just doing what's fair." With the house emptied of our contributions, we also cut the financial cord that had bound us to Mrs. Thompson. The monthly checks we had been sending were no more. It was a hard decision, but necessary for us to truly start anew. The final blow to Mrs. Thompson's crumbling world came when she had to face the financial consequences of her actions. In order to reimburse us for the extensive and costly renovations, she was forced to sell the house. The place that had been a symbol of her deceit now had to be let go, the proceeds going towards paying us back. The news of the sale came to us not with joy but with a quiet acknowledgement of the closure it brought. We had no desire to revel in her downfall, we simply wanted to move forward. In the end, Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway of what was once her home, now belonging to another family, her eyes red from tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again, her voice lost in the shuffle of movers and the bustle of new occupants. We left her there, her apologies a faint echo in our determined stride away. Our path led back to our apartment, to the life we had been building before everything went awry. We walked hand in hand, not looking back. The apartment welcomed us with open arms, its walls ready to be filled with new memories and laughter. And as we settled back into the rhythm of our life, the nursery awaiting its occupant, we knew that we had come out of this stronger. We had fought for our future, for our family, and no matter what else lay ahead, we would face it together. Life has a funny way of smoothing out the edges after a storm. Our apartment, once a temporary shelter, had transformed back into a loving home. With the past finally behind us, Alex and I focused on the future, especially with our baby's arrival just around the corner. One evening, as I was arranging some baby clothes, Alex came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "You know, I can't wait to meet our little one. It's like the start of something amazing, isn't it?" he said, his voice warm and excited. I leaned back into his embrace, feeling the gentle kick from our unborn child. "It really is. After everything, this feels like we've been given a fresh start, a new chapter." We spent our evenings planning and dreaming, talking about the kind of parents we wanted to be, the things we wanted to teach our child. The nursery, once a source of contention, was now a haven of hope and anticipation, filled with soft colors and the gentle lullabies that floated from a music box. The day our daughter was born, the world seemed to stand still. She was perfect, a tiny bundle of joy that instantly became the center of our universe. Holding her for the first time, I felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed me. As we sat there, in the quiet of the nursery, the world outside continuing on, I realized that this was what true happiness felt like. It wasn't about the absence of conflict or the avoidance of challenges. It was about facing them head-on, together, and coming out the other side stronger and more united. I'm Lily, a 32-year-old woman who believed in the warmth of love and the promise of a shared future. My husband, Ethan, was once the sun in my sky, but over the years, his light has dimmed, leaving me in a growing chill of neglect and harsh words. It started subtly, a missed dinner here, a harsh word there. But then it became our norm. His once tender glances turned cold, and his touches, which used to spark joy, became rare and perfunctory. One particularly cold evening, I was attempting to bridge the distance that had formed between us, setting up a nice dinner hoping to recapture some of our old warmth. "Ethan, dinner's ready," I called out, trying to inject some cheer into my voice. He walked in, his eyes scanning the table, not a flicker of appreciation in his gaze. "You know I don't like salmon," he muttered, his words clipped. "But you used to love it," I replied, the hurt clear in my voice. He shrugged, dismissing my effort and the memories attached to it. "That was then. Can't you do anything right, Lily?" His words stung, each one a reminder of how far we drifted. I bit my lip, holding back tears, as I watched him eat in silence, his indifference a stark contrast to the love-filled meals we once shared. After dinner, as I was cleaning up, the weight of his growing disdain and blame became too much to bear silently. "Why do you treat me this way, Ethan? What happened to us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He scoffed, standing up to leave the room. "Maybe if you weren't so barren, things would be different. You're just not enough, Lily. Not as a wife, not as a woman." His cruel words echoed in the now empty room, each syllable etched painfully into my heart. I was left alone, with the remnants of a dinner that tasted of lost love and broken dreams. That night, as I lay in bed, Ethan's presence beside me felt like miles apart. I turned away, my silent tears a testament to the cold shift that had taken over our lives. It was clear that I was alone in my pain, my longing for a child turned into a weapon of blame and shame. The next day, I confided in my diary, the only place I felt safe to express my deepest fears and sorrows. "He doesn't see me anymore, doesn't hear me. I'm just a shadow in my own home, a ghost of the woman I used to be." The evening of the family dinner arrived with a tension I could almost taste. Ethan's parents, Mary and George, had always treated me with kindness, a stark contrast to their son's recent coldness. As we gathered around the dining table, the air was filled with the clinking of cutlery and the simmering undercurrent of unspoken issues. George, ever the patriarch, raised his glass to toast. "To family," he declared with a warm smile. "To family," we echoed, our voices a chorus of varying emotions. As the dinner progressed, the conversation drifted to the topic I dreaded most, children. George, with his usual bluntness, broached the subject. "For years, Ethan, Lily. We were hoping for a grandchild to spoil by now." Ethan's mother, Mary, chimed in, her voice gentle yet firm. "Perhaps it's time to consider seeing a specialist. There could be many reasons for not conceiving, and it's best to understand them." I felt Ethan's gaze on me, his eyes like ice. "We know the reason, don't we, Lily? It's her," he said, his voice dripping with accusation. The words stung, more so under the concerned gaze of his parents. "It's not just about me, Ethan. It takes two, you know," I replied, my voice steady but my hands trembling under the table. Mary, with her medical background, sensed the tension. "Then it's settled. Both of you will go for a checkup. It's the only way to know for sure," she stated, a note of finality in her voice. Ethan laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure, we'll go. But we already know the answer, don't we?" Later that evening, as Ethan and I cleaned up in silence, the weight of the situation bore down on me. The idea of the medical examinations loomed large, a beacon of hope and a source of dread all at once. "Ethan," I started, breaking the silence, "I'm scared. What if there's really something wrong with me?" He didn't look at me, his focus on the dishes in the sink. "Then we'll know, won't we? Better than living in denial." His words were meant to be dismissive, but I caught the flicker of something else in his voice. Fear? Uncertainty? It was hard to tell. As I went to bed that night, the house felt colder than ever. The uncertainty of the coming days was a heavy blanket, smothering the last embers of warmth between us. Yet, despite everything, a part of me clung to the hope that the tests might lead to a solution, a way forward out of this stagnant bitterness. The days following our medical examinations were some of the longest of my life. As I awaited the results, my thoughts constantly circled back to what they might reveal, to the myriad of ways they could impact our already strained relationship. Ethan, however, seemed more irritable than anxious, his patience wearing thinner with each passing day. One afternoon, as I sat lost in thought, Ethan stormed into the room, his face twisted with annoyance. "Look at this place, Lily. It's a mess. You're so caught up in your own head, you've let the house go." Before I could respond, he grabbed my hand and practically dragged me into his office. "Start here. I want every surface clean, especially my desk. I can't work in this filth." His words stung, but I bit my tongue and began to clean, my motions mechanical as I tried to suppress the hurt and confusion swirling inside me. As I moved to dust his desk, my hand accidentally caught the edge of a folder, sending it tumbling to the floor, papers spilling out in a chaotic cascade. I knelt to gather them, apologizing under my breath, but as I started to put them back, my eyes caught on the contents. There were medical insurance papers, hospital receipts for childbirth, all paid for by Ethan. A name I didn't recognize, likely the mother, was listed, along with a date not too far in the past. The truth hit me like a physical blow. Ethan had a child with another woman. My heart pounded, a mix of shock, betrayal, and a deep, searing pain coursing through me. But I knew I couldn't confront him, not yet. I needed to be smart, to gather evidence and plan my next steps carefully. Once I was sure Ethan was occupied elsewhere, I quickly copied all the documents, my hands shaking as I worked. Each copy was a silent confirmation of the lies and deceit that had infiltrated our marriage, of the double life Ethan had been leading right under my nose. As I tucked the copies away in a safe place, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The hurt was still there, a dull, persistent ache, but it was now accompanied by a clarity of purpose. I wouldn't let Ethan get away with this betrayal. I would bide my time, wait for the right moment to reveal everything. For the rest of the day, I moved through the house like a shadow, performing my chores with a mechanical efficiency. Ethan remained oblivious, wrapped up in his own affairs, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. That night, as I lay in bed, Ethan's breathing steady and even beside me, I couldn't help but wonder how many other nights he'd shared with another, how many lies he'd told to cover his tracks. The pain was almost unbearable, but it was also a catalyst, transforming my sadness and despair into a quiet, burning resolve. I didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was clear: I wouldn't be the silent, suffering wife any longer. I would confront Ethan, confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The wait for the examination results was still there, a looming question mark in our lives, but it was no longer the only thing defining my existence. I had a plan, a purpose, and I would see it through to the end. No more waiting, no more wondering. It was time to act. As Ethan's birthday unfolded, the house buzzed with the hum of conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. I circulated among the guests, a smile plastered on my face, my heart racing with the anticipation of the revelation to come. When it was time for Ethan to open his gifts, the room filled with the rustle of wrapping paper and appreciative murmurs. Finally, it was my turn. I handed him a neatly wrapped box, my hand steady, my resolve firm. "Happy birthday, Ethan," I said, my voice betraying none of my inner turmoil. He accepted it with a confident smirk, perhaps expecting something mundane, something that would affirm the facade of our marriage. But as he lifted the lid and his eyes scanned the contents, his expression morphed from smug assurance to utter shock. "What's this?" he stammered, his voice faltering as he held up the documents for the room to see. "It's the truth," I said simply, standing firm amidst the sudden wave of tension that swept through the room. The guests leaned in, a collective intake of breath filling the space as they tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. Ethan's mother, Mary, took the papers from his trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the details spelled out on the page. "Ethan, is this true? Do you have a child with another woman?" Her voice was a mix of disbelief and rising anger. Ethan's face turned pale, his usual composure shattered. "It's not how it looks, I can explain." He fumbled with the papers, his gaze darting around the room, desperately seeking an ally. But there was no respite to be found. The guests murmured among themselves, the air thick with judgment and shock. Ethan's father, George, stood up, his face a mask of disappointment and rage. "Explain? How could you do this, not just to Lily, but to all of us? We're your family." His voice boomed, cutting through the whispers like a knife. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked around at the faces of friends and family, at the disillusionment and accusation reflected back at him. The room, once filled with the warmth of celebration, now felt cold, the air heavy with betrayal. I watched him, feeling a mixture of vindication and sorrow. "Everyone, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I thought it was time the truth came out," I said, addressing the room. The guests remained in place, the celebration forgotten, as the gravity of the situation settled upon us all. No one moved to leave, the shock of the revelation rooting them to the spot. The festive atmosphere had been irrevocably tainted, the joy of the occasion turned to ash. Ethan looked around, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, I saw the realization of the consequences of his actions dawn upon him. The room stayed silent, the tension palpable, as we all waited for what would come next. The revelation had been made, and now, there was no turning back. As the room's shock over the initial revelation began to settle, I knew it was time to deliver the final blow. Ethan, pale and shaken from the fallout of his exposed secrets, was still grasping at strangled threads of dignity when I stepped forward, holding another set of documents. "Ethan," I began, my voice clear and unwavering, "there's more you need to know." I handed him the envelope containing the medical results we'd both been anxiously awaiting. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath as Ethan's hands trembled slightly while opening it. His eyes scanned the contents, and the color completely drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale. "What is it, Ethan? What does it say?" his mother, Mary, demanded, her voice sharp with concern and growing anger. He couldn't speak, couldn't even lift his gaze from the paper that spelled out a truth so ironic it was almost poetic. He was the one who was infertile. I spoke up, filling the heavy silence. "The tests show that Ethan is infertile. It's not me who's been unable to conceive." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Whispers erupted among the guests, a mix of sympathy for me and disbelief at Ethan's situation. His parents, Mary and George, looked from the papers to their son with expressions that morphed from shock to anger. "Infertile? But you blamed Lily all this time." Mary's voice cracked, her disappointment palpable. George stood, his disappointment hardening into a cold fury. "You've not only been unfaithful and lied to us all, but you dared to shame and blame Lily for something that was your own issue." The accusations flew, thick and fast, each one landing like a blow. Ethan's facade of control shattered completely, leaving behind a man I barely recognized. He was no longer the confident, sometimes arrogant person I had married. Instead, he was small, exposed, and undeniably alone. "But I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper against the storm of condemnation. "It doesn't matter if you knew or not," George boomed, his voice resonating with finality. "You've deceived everyone here, most of all Lily." The room buzzed with the weight of betrayal and deceit. Ethan's life, once so orderly and controlled, was unraveling before our very eyes. His once loving parents now looked at him with eyes filled with something akin to strangers' disdain. As the room processed the news, Ethan's mother, Mary, turned to him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Ethan, if you're infertile, then who is the father of your mistress's child?" The question hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Ethan's shock was apparent, his face contorting into an expression of disbelief and betrayal. I don't know. I never considered she might be cheating on me too." The admission sent a ripple through the room, the guests exchanging looks of disbelief and pity. George, Ethan's father, stood up, his stature commanding the attention of everyone present. "You've been deceived, son, just as you've deceived us all. It's a bitter irony that's hard to swallow." The accusations continued to fly, each word a nail in the coffin of Ethan's once neatly arranged life. His parents, once his staunchest supporters, now looked at him with eyes filled with disappointment and a deep, unspoken sadness. They had lost a grandson they thought they had and were now grappling with the reality of their son's deceit and the complexities of his betrayal. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Ethan seemed to crumble, his usual arrogance and control evaporating into the charged air of the room. I need to figure this out. I need to understand what's happened," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The guests began to leave, the atmosphere too charged with anger and disillusionment to bear. Ethan's parents remained, their expressions grim and thoughtful, a stark contrast to the joy and celebration that had marked the beginning of the evening. The room emptied until it was just Ethan, his parents, and me. The silence that followed was a testament to the broken relationships and trust that lay in tatters around us. Ethan's world had come crashing down, and as he sat there, head in his hands, it was clear that the journey ahead would be a difficult one, filled with introspection, legal battles, and the daunting task of rebuilding his shattered life. For me, the revelation of the medical results was a vindication of sorts, but it was also a reminder of the complex web of lies and deceit that had ensnared us all. As I looked around the room, at the faces of those I had once considered family, I knew that while this chapter was closing, the story was far from over. There were questions to be answered, wounds to heal, and a new path to forge. The tables had turned, indeed, but the full extent of the fallout was yet to be realized. The dust had barely settled after the revelations of Ethan's birthday when I found myself navigating the aftermath of our shattered marriage. The house, once filled with shared dreams and laughter, now echoed with the heavy silence of our broken vows. Ethan, a mere shadow of the man I once knew, tried to approach me the morning after, his eyes rimmed with red, a mix of sleeplessness and perhaps regret. "Lily," he started, his voice hoarse. I don't even know what to say." "What is there to say, Ethan?" I replied, my voice steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside. "The truth is out. There's no taking it back." He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture that now seemed foreign. "I know I've messed up, more than I can ever fix. But I was scared, Lily. Scared of what it meant to be infertile, to not be able to give us, what we wanted." I sighed, feeling the weight of his words, yet unable to fully comprehend the depth of his deceit. "Being scared doesn't excuse your actions, Ethan. You lied, you cheated, and you hurt everyone around you, especially me." He nodded, the fight seemingly gone from him. "I know. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, if not for us, then for my own conscience." The room grew quiet, the air between us thick with unsaid words and unresolved pain. I knew that the path ahead was one I would have to walk alone, the trust and love we once shared now just remnants of a past life. In the days that followed, I took action. I met with lawyers, collected the necessary documents, and filed for divorce. Each step felt like a liberation, a reclaiming of the dignity and respect I had lost in the shadow of Ethan's betrayal. The legal proceedings were a blur, a series of meetings and signatures that dissolved the life we had built together. Ethan didn't fight it, his compliance a small solace in the storm of our separation. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, the final papers in hand, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. My marriage was over, the dreams we shared irreparably damaged. Yet, I also felt a spark of hope, a sense that from the ashes of this ordeal, a new, stronger Lily was emerging. The community, once so integral to our lives, watched from a distance, their whispers and pitying glances a constant reminder of the scandal that had unfolded. But among the murmurs, I also found support, friends and neighbors reaching out with offers of help and words of encouragement. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, the sun warming my face, Mary came to visit. Her eyes were kind, but I saw the hurt that still lingered there. "Lily, I just want you to know, we don't blame you. You've handled this with more grace than anyone could expect," she said, taking my hand in hers. I looked at her, the woman who had been like a mother to me, and felt a pang of shared loss. "Thank you, Mary. I just wish things could have been different." She squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the complex tangle of emotions that surrounded us. "You'll always be part of this family, Lily. No matter what." The conversation lingered in the air long after she left, a bittersweet reminder of the ties that still bound me to the life I was leaving behind. As I packed up my belongings, each object a memory of the life Ethan and I had shared, I realized that this wasn't just an end, it was also a beginning. A chance to rebuild, to rediscover who I was outside the shadow of my marriage. And as I turned the key in the lock one last time, leaving behind the house that had been my home, I knew that this wasn't just a farewell. It was a declaration of independence, a first step into a future that, while uncertain, was entirely my own. The finality of signing the divorce papers was both liberating and somber. I had filed for divorce from Ethan, demanding compensation for the emotional turmoil and betrayal he caused. My lawyer, a competent and empathetic woman, assured me that the evidence I gathered made a strong case for a substantial settlement. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself entangled not only in our divorce but also in a legal battle with the mistress who had deceived him. He had spent a fortune on medical expenses and supporting the child he believed was his, only to discover the web of lies that had ensnared him. Now, he was suing her, trying to recoup some of his losses and salvage what little dignity he had left. I watched from a distance as Ethan's once controlled and proud life unraveled. There was no joy in seeing him brought so low, but neither was there pity. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. The man I once loved had become a stranger, one whose fate no longer stirred any emotion in me other than a detached acknowledgement that justice, in its own way, was being served. As for me, I was busy building a new life. The settlement from the divorce provided a financial cushion that allowed me some peace of mind. I moved into a new place, smaller and cozier than the house I shared with Ethan, a place that quickly started to feel like home. It was my sanctuary, filled with my things, decorated to my taste, a visual representation of my newfound independence. I often sat in my new living room, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on the tumultuous journey I had undergone. The tears and heartache felt like a distant memory, and in their place was a growing sense of self-awareness and strength. I had survived the worst of storms, and now relished the calm that followed. Friends and family were a constant source of support, their love and care helping to mend the parts of me that were broken by Ethan's betrayal. They cheered me on as I took the first tentative steps into a future that was entirely my own, unshaded by the expectations or failings of another. In the end, I found that I didn't need revenge or to see Ethan suffer. My greatest triumph was in reclaiming my life, in proving to myself that I could move past the pain and emerge stronger and more resilient. The wounds he inflicted would always be part of my story, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they were a testament to my ability to overcome and to thrive, despite the odds. As I closed this chapter of my life, I felt a profound sense of closure and optimism. The journey ahead was mine alone, filled with opportunities and experiences waiting to be discovered. And as I stepped out each day, I did so with a lighter heart and a certainty that no matter what the future held, I was ready for it, stronger and wiser than ever before. Ethan was a chapter closed, a lesson learned, and now it was time to write new stories, ones filled with hope, growth, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Hi, I'm Marie. Mom and wife full-time, that's me. Paul, that's my husband, works a trading gig, and let's just say he's married to his job just as much as he is to me. Used to scribble down thoughts on books, reading between and beyond the lines, but these days I'm more about reading bedtime stories to our boy, Jack. Life threw some curveballs early on, lost my parents when I still needed them. That was rough. Then along came Paul, with a family in tow. His folks were the real deal, good people, you know. Took me in, no questions. Made me feel like I finally belonged somewhere again. Been with Paul for years now, since those college days when love seemed to be enough to fill any void. We settled into a rhythm, he at work and me taking care of everything else. But man, did that rhythm skip and stumble when Jack came into the picture. Paul changed, or maybe this was always him, just waiting for a reason to surface. He'd come home on a Friday night with a few too many drinks in him, loose-lipped and surly. "You gotta start shedding that weight, Marie," he'd snipe after slipping off his tie. "You barely fit in those jeans anymore." I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt, but I told myself to brush it off, toughen up, maybe he'd cool down by morning. But mornings just brought hangovers and silence until the next round. The house became this place where I tiptoed, trying not to set Paul off. Jack, little trooper, he could feel it too, sticking close, watching his old man with wide, careful eyes. One particularly rough Friday, Paul came home and made a beeline for the fridge, crack open a cold one. I was on the floor with Jack, blocks scattered around. "Another day in paradise, huh?" Paul sneered, leaning against the counter. I forced a smile. Just the usual, chasing after this little tornado. I ruffled Jack's hair, but my heart wasn't in it. Paul tossed his head back, downing half the bottle. Maybe put some of that energy into a workout routine, eh? I bit my tongue, counting to 10 in my head. I'll look into it, was all I managed, shuffling Jack into his pile of toys, anything to escape the cutting edge in Paul's tone. But the weight wasn't just on my hips, it was on my chest, heavy, making it hard to breathe. I didn't know who I was in Paul's eyes anymore. I had finally shaken off those last stubborn pounds. It felt good, kind of. But Paul, well, he had a talent for finding flaws. My sweats and baggy tees were the new target. Jesus, Marie, you dress like you're living at the gym. When was the last time you dressed up? Remember how you used to look? There he was, leaning on the doorframe with that look that said everything his words didn't. I glanced down at my stretched-out mom life tee and yoga pants. This is just practical, Paul. You want me all dolled up to do laundry and wrangle our son? One corner of his mouth curled up like he had just made a successful trade. I dunno, how about looking good for your husband? That used to matter. I sighed, rolling my eyes. Well, unless my husband starts taking meetings at the playground or the grocery store, I think I'll stick with practical. He shook his head, chuckling without humor. You used to care, Marie. His voice trailed off as he wandered back toward the living room, his disapproval hanging in the air like a bad smell. Then there was Jack, our boy, trying to navigate the shaky terrain between us. I was teaching him please and thank you, thinking manners mattered. Paul caught a bit of our lesson one afternoon and scoffed. Look at you, teaching him to be Mr. Manners. You want him to get trampled on? Manners are important, Paul. It's about respect, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Respect is earned, not politeness the least, he shot back. He needs to toughen up, not be some yes, please pushover. Then the whole freeloader thing started. One night, Paul came home, askew, looking like he had won and lost the same fight. Nice day? He asked, sarcasm heavy as he glanced around what I'd come to see as our minefield of a home. I put down Jack's toy and braced for what was coming. Just the same, dealing with tantrums and spills. How was work? Paul's laugh was short and sharp. Work? Oh, it was just dandy, supporting a parasite. My cheeks burned. Excuse me? My voice was a little too loud. Jack's eyes flitted from me to Paul, sensing the shift. A parasite, Marie. I work, you play house, he said, each word pointed and heavy. That's the thanks I get? I am raising our child, Paul. Your child. That's work. That's vital, I said, my voice rising now, too. Jack started fussing then, picking up on the tension. I swept him up into my arms, trying to shield him from the fallout. Paul had a knack for knowing when he'd pushed too far, and his next words were more measured. Marie, I go out there and deal with sharks all day. Come home, and what? I don't know, something different. I can't be your one-man show, Paul, I said softly, trying to defuse the bomb that our marriage had become. I'm here, juggling a million things for us, for Jack. We looked at each other then, really looked, and I wondered if he saw the plea in my eyes. The help me, back me up, be with me that I felt screaming inside. But he turned away, the finality of his silence telling me that no, he didn't see. He didn't want to. One day, the disrespect boiled over. Jack scrunched up his little face and called me a name, a real zinger. He got it from Paul. You're just a lazy bum, he had hurled at me, his tiny voice bitter and angry. I felt like I'd been slapped. What? Jack, no, you can't say that, I stumbled, shocked. He folded his arms, stubborn as his dad. Dad says it, so can I. That was the last straw. When Paul got home, I was waiting, steaming like a forgotten kettle. You know what your son called me today? I laid into him without waiting for an answer. Paul dropped his keys on the counter and chuckled, clearly not seeing the line had been crossed. What did he say? The truth? He tossed his words over his shoulder as he walked to the fridge, his casualness like acid on my skin. Is that funny to you? I was shouting now, my usual restraint snapped tight as a dry twig. Your son is calling me names. Paul leaned against the kitchen counter, beer in hand, a smirk blooming on his face. Oh, come on, Marie. Kid's gotta learn to stand his ground. I was staring at him, hands balled into fists. By disrespecting his mother? He shrugged, a lazy lift of his shoulders that sent me teetering on the edge. You're too soft on him. Look, he's getting some spine. Spine? My voice shot up another octave. He's learning to be just like you. Paul grinned and ruffled Jack's hair. Ain't that right, champ? I turned to Jack, who was looking at us with eyes that were too old for his face. Jack, listen to me. What you said to me this morning was wrong. You can't talk to people like that. Jack's chin jutted out, defiant and stubborn. But Dad. I don't care what Dad says, you listen to your mom. I cut him off, my heart thudding like a drum. I was desperate for him not to follow in Paul's footsteps. But Paul wasn't letting it go. The boy's gotta learn to speak up. World's not gonna hand him anything. You keep coddling him, he'll end up. I get it, all right? I get it. I cut him off, feeling the weight of his words like a physical thing on my chest. But there's a line. You don't get it, do you? Paul threw up his hands, that ugly smirk still there. Whatever, Marie. You make mountains out of molehills. I turned from him, that burning in my chest now a churning mess. This is not how I want our son to grow up. This disrespect ends now, it ends here. Paul just took a swig of his beer, and I knew, right then, my words were just bouncing off him. I looked at Jack, really looked at him. You apologize to me, now, I said, the power in my voice surprising even me. Jack's eyes darted between me and Paul, but he knew that tone. Sorry, Mom. The word was small, almost lost in the kitchen, but it was there and it was a start. I moved closer to Jack, knelt down so I was eye level with him. Thank you. We treat each other with respect in this house, you got it? Paul snorted behind me, but I ignored him. Jack nodded, a hint of my boy peeking through that new sullen shadow he wore. It was a crack in the wall Paul was building around him, a crack, but also a starting point. I stood up, squared my shoulders. We're going to fix this, Jack. No more name-calling, no more disrespect. We're better than that. I took Jack's hand, and we left the room, leaving Paul and his smugness behind us. I stood there on the sidewalk, my phone shaking in my hand. It was one of those moments where your gut ties up in knots. There, across the street, Paul was laughing it up with some woman. Blonde, curvy, and looking at my husband like he was the last piece of chocolate in the box. My thumb pressed record before I even decided to. The walk home felt a million miles long. A part of me hoped it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. Back in our kitchen, I threw my keys on the counter. Paul was sitting there with a beer, like he always did, but today the sight of him made me sick. Without a word, I tossed my phone on the table in front of him, the video playing. Care to explain? Paul looked at the screen, his eyes going hard when he saw what was on it. He muted it, placed it calmly on the counter, and then looked straight at me. Yeah, she's beautiful, he said, his voice dripping venom. You used to be like that. I felt the slap of his words, my cheeks flaming with anger, my body tense. So, that's it, huh? You parade around town with some woman while I'm at home? Paul stood up, his chair scraping back against the tile. He was too close now, his voice low and mean. What, you stalking me now, Marie? Can't handle the fact that maybe there's more out there than what's inside these walls? I was reeling, feeling the pieces click together. Cut the crap, Paul. You're cheating. He didn't even flinch. You wanna know why? He said, his chest puffing up. Because around her, I'm somebody. Not just the guy who pays the bills or the bad guy 'cause he ain't Mr. Rogers. So that's it? I edged back, feeling the counter dig into my hips. Your family's not enough for you? Paul snorted and grabbed his beer again. It stopped being enough a long time ago. Maybe if you'd have kept up with yourself, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere. The bile rattled in my throat. I'm not the one who promised till death do us part. His laugh was short and punched the air. Those are just words, Marie. They stopped meaning anything to you a long time ago. I should have been crying, but the tears wouldn't come. I was just empty and angry. I gave you everything, Paul. I gave you a son, I made a home for us. And this is how you repay me? He took a long drink, then leaned back against the counter. You gave me a home? Looks like a prison to me. Same old, every damn day. You think that's a life? We made vows, Paul. I shouted, my voice cracking. Yeah, and you broke them every day with your sweatpants and constant nagging. His face twisted into something ugly, something monstrous. That was the last thing he said before I walked out, my heart numb, anger seeping into every corner of my being. I was on edge the whole ride over to Paul's folks' place. It was gonna be nasty, but I had to lay it out for them. They needed to know who their son really was. His mom answered the door, with a happy smile. Marie, what brings you here at this hour? I just barreled past her. I gotta show you both something. Once his dad came in, I played them the video straight up. His mom gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. His dad, red-faced and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, he barked at me, Paul's gotta stop this nonsense now. And like that, all hell broke loose. That night back at our place, Paul kicked off as soon as I walked in. You had to drag my parents into this, didn't ya? His voice was loaded, ready to fire. Yeah, well someone's got to. I shot back, my nerves steel. He was a storm brewing. With a step towards me, his hand raised, but he didn't get far. You're bad. Jack's voice cut through, strong and braver than any of us. Paul stopped stone cold. Paul's hand dropped, and his mask slipped a second, shock in his eyes. But then he hardened up again, cold as steel. I want you out, he said, spitting the words like they were sour. Take the kid and go. So we went. With Jack's hand in mine, I didn't look back. Bags thrown in the back of the car, we headed for the city, miles of road unwinding like my thoughts. The luxury house was something else, my unexpected inheritance. 2 stories, white columns, and a porch you could throw a party on, all waiting in another city, away from everything that had gone wrong. None of my folks, not even a whisker of Paul or his clan, had ever set eyes on it. When we pulled up to this grand house, Jack's face pressed to the window, eyes as wide as the moon. Is this a castle? His voice was a whisper, almost lost in the vastness of it all. Something like that, I said, a laugh escaping me for the first time in. I couldn't even remember. We stepped into that house, our new beginning. It was silent, save for the echo of our footsteps on the marble floors, bouncing off the high ceilings crowned with crystal chandeliers. The furniture was swanky, left behind by folks I wish had lasted a lifetime longer. I plopped down on a couch soft as clouds, and finally, Jack's laughter filled the rooms. The sound of it was more luxurious than anything else in this place. We explored room after room, Jack running ahead like he was leading a parade. Each new door opened to a room grander than the last. I call the biggest one, he declared, claiming a bedroom that overlooked a garden already blooming with the promise of spring. Laying him down to bed that night, the day finally caught up with me. My eyes burned with the tiredness of it all, but looking around at the high ceilings, the gold trimming catching moonlight, I knew we were worlds away from where we started. Sitting there, in the quiet of a room too nice for today's shadows, I whispered into the darkness, "We made it, kiddo." Life in the big house slowly shed the shadows of the past. Jack's giggles filled the halls more than the echoes of old fears. Most days, it felt like we had always been there, just the two of us, in our new safe haven. The house, with its silent strength, was keeping the world at bay until the day Paul showed up, uninvited and unwelcome. He was at the door in a storm of anger. I opened it and there he was, looking like trouble had followed him around. "You can't just disappear with my son, Marie." I leaned against the door frame, unfazed. "He's my son too. And I didn't disappear. I moved on." Paul's scowl deepened. He glanced around, taking in the opulence of the place with wide, disbelieving eyes. "How can you afford this? I know you don't make this kind of dough." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. "Well, turns out I had a little left over each month. Who knew?" He raised an eyebrow, a sly accusation in his gaze. "And I'm struggling to cover rent for that old place by myself. It's damn near impossible now that they jacked up the price." I shook my head. He always was good at playing the martyr. "That's not my problem anymore, Paul. I've been using my own savings to cover the gap in the rent for years. Savings that, thank God, I don't need to bleed dry for that house anymore." The greed in his eyes flared up like wildfire. "What, and you're living here in luxury while I—" "Stop right there," I cut in. "This isn't your concern. This," I motioned to the grand house behind me, "is mine. Mine and Jack's." Paul took a step forward, but I didn't back down. "Look, I came here to fix things. I'm saying I forgive you for all this sneaking around." His audacity almost knocked the wind out of me, but I had a little surprise that would put the brakes on his charade. From behind the door, I pulled out the divorce papers and slapped them into his chest. "And here's what I'm saying. We're done." He looked as if I'd slapped him with a physical hand, his face twisting through confusion, rage, and then settling on calculating desperation. "You can't do this. What about Jack?" I stood taller, my resolve like iron. "I'm doing it for Jack. He doesn't need this chaos you bring. Sign the papers, Paul. It's over." He glanced from the papers to me, then back again, his posture deflating slightly. "You'll regret this. You can't make it alone." "That's where you're wrong." I smiled, not from humor but from a deep-seated confidence. "I'm already making it. And without you, we're doing more than just fine. We're thriving." With a shake of his head, Paul looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he turned on his heel and strode away, clutching the papers like they were a snake that could bite. Once he was gone, the house seemed to exhale with me. I closed the door gently, turning back to the life I had fought so hard for. Life had a way of tossing stuff at you, hard and fast. It was Thursday, the kind of day that should have been easy, but it wasn't. We shirked dinner for a bit, setting up ramps out of old books and watching the Lego car stupidly do flips and land upside down. Jack's laugh was infectious, the sort that wiped clean the worry lines off my face. His enthusiasm was a reminder that amid all the crap, there was still good, simple, unadulterated good. Then it came, a banging on the door that made my stomach drop and my face lose all its motherly warmth. Paul had a knack for bad timing and worse entrances. I pulled the door open and there he was, looking like he'd just come from a bar fight or lost a bet. "Paul, what's up?" He scowled, that usual look he gets when he thinks the world owes him. "So, this the high life? You playing house with my Jack while I'm scraping pennies just to get by?" Jack peeked from behind me, a knight in Lego armor. "Hey, screw off, Paul. Don't talk to my mom like that." Paul's face turned a nice shade of tomato. "The hell? You let him talk like that?" I stood there, hands on hips. "He's expressing himself. Something I should have done with you a long time ago." Jack came out from behind me, all fierce. "Yeah, get lost. My mom, my rules." Paul's anger was something else, a storm that had nowhere to go. "You think you're smart, huh? Talking to your old man like that?" Jack squared his shoulders, a small David to Paul's Goliath. "Don't gotta think. I know it. Mom knows it. Paul opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There was Jack, staring him down, waiting. This was no place for Paul anymore, no place for his bluster and noise. After a tense moment, Paul shook his head, muttered something under his breath and stormed off the porch. Jack turned to me with this look, the kind of look that said, "We got this." I nodded, all the agreement he needed. We went back to boiling pasta and racing Lego cars. That's how we do it, simple, nothing fancy. We just keep on. I was gabbing on the phone with Miss Dottie, Paul's mom, who was more my family than is now. "Honey, you just holler if there's anything you need, 'kay?" Her voice was always a warm blanket over the line. "We're all good, Miss Dottie. Really, couldn't be better," I assured her, twisting the cord around my finger. She hummed a pleased note. "Just makes my heart full to hear that. Keep on keeping on, you hear?" Frank, her husband, yelled from somewhere behind her. "Tell her that any time she wants to send over some of that lemon meringue, we won't complain." A genuine laugh burst out of me. "Expect a pie on your doorstep soon, Frank." Exchanging a few more pleasantries, we hung up. I shook my head. If someone had told me last year I'd be mining gold from the wreckage of my married life, I would have laughed in their face. Jack pulled on my sleeve, waving his drawing like a five-star general. "Look, Mom. This is our house." I looked down. His scribbles had heart. A big square house and two stick figures, a little one and a tall one, with sloppy grins and a lopsided sun shining down. The swing I'd put up for him stood out in green and brown strokes. "That's us, right?" A dumb question, really, but it made him nod with pride. "And I'm gonna sell my art, make us rich." There was serious conviction behind his toothy smile. "If you do, you're buying me that fancy coffee I've been eyeing?" I nudged him with a wink. He nodded, his expression all business. "Only the best for my mom." And just like that, the knot in my chest loosened a bit more. Sundays were like that, full of little miracles. The thing was, life had done a real number on us, but it was looking up. Paul got slammed by the door he let hit him on his way out. The fancy house he rented to impress his mistress turned out to be a couple of sizes too big for his wallet. Now he was cooped up in a tiny apartment, the kind of place his pride wouldn't have let him consider a year ago. And the mistress? She hightailed it the minute his pockets turned up empty and his promises hollow. But that was a tale for some other time. Right now was about Jack and me, and the park we were marching to, hand in hand. We stepped out, and the door clicked shut, a soft full stop to one chapter before immediately kicking off the next. Jack tugged me towards the park, his excitement bubbling over. I didn't glance back at our home, no need. Ahead was everything that mattered, me and my boy, parts of a world that kept on spinning, even when you felt like you'd fallen off.